Soundings Audiobooks presents an unabridged recording of An Ill Wind, written by David Donachie, read by Peter Wickham. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Soundings, Whitley Bay, NE 26 2JT. Chapter 1. The evacuation of Toulon left no time for anyone to be shy when it came to being active. The defences were falling to the French revolutionary armies in increasing numbers, the forts being abandoned, blowing their stores of powder, and the general situation was deteriorating by the hour. Even if Lieutenant John Pearce, a naval officer by accident rather than design, thought himself free from the need to respond to orders, to refuse to serve under such circumstances, when the fate of the entire garrison was at stake, would have been churlish in the extreme. Thus he found himself, along with those men for whom he had taken responsibility, aboard the fireship HMS Vulcan, heading past the Grosse Tour and into an inner bay known as the Petite Rade, his destination the naval harbour of Toulon, intent on adding to the destruction. Beneath his feet the ship was being primed, which meant the barrels of powder and pitch with which it was equipped were being linked to the fuses and highly inflammable liquids which would turn the vessel into an explosive fireball. HMS Vulcan was leading a small squadron made up of manned galleys under the command of Captain Sir Sidney Smith, tasked with ensuring that when the port finally fell to the enemy, little of military value would be left for their use. The fireship was to be laid alongside the capital ships of the French fleet, those not fit for sea, or vessels that could not be manned and sailed out. Once ignited, HMS Vulcan would turn into the torch that destroyed them, and they in turn would fire the rest of the vessels tied up to the naval quays. Not content that such measures would be sufficient, it had been decided that fires must be set on the vessels themselves to ensure ruin, just in case the French sought to save them. While Pearce agreed that the service was necessary, there were friends with him who did not, the group of fellows of which he was one, who knew themselves collectively as the Pelicans. "They are short of men," Pearce insisted. "Short of men?" grumbled Charlie Taverner, the least eager to undertake the service. "How can a whole fleet be short of men?" "There are not enough hands to crew all the ships in the French fleet, and, according to Admiral Lord Hood, scarce enough to man the vessels he already commands, given the losses he has suffered." "Old Hood must be desperate to send for you, Charlie." That jest got Michael O'Hagan a queer look, which only made the huge Irishman laugh more, his eyes narrowing in that massive head, yet still able to twinkle from the reflected light of the fires that surrounded the bay. "Even Rufus here has at least the virtue of being willing." "No, I ain't," Rufus Dommett protested. He had been agreeable when asked, but as ever when challenged wanted to side with Charlie. "Well," Pearce sighed, "we are here now, so unless you're in the mood to swim it would be best to get through with it, and then get back to the hospital to load the wounded before that too is overrun." That was the duty he'd been drawn away from. The hospital in question lay on the Saint-Mandrier Peninsula, and was extremely vulnerable to enemy attack, protected as it was by a poorly manned and equipped redoubt with a narrow neck joined the mainland. Indeed, it would have fallen if its strategic position had been of value. Luckily, the French attack was not one designed to take territory, but to render the anchorages of Toulon untenable. In short, to drive out the combined fleets of Britain, Spain, and Naples, because to stay within range of the shore-based enemy cannon would be too costly. The name of the man directing this assault was known to all now, not the general in command, but the artillery officer, a fellow called Bonaparte, who had cleverly eschewed infantry assaults and instead moved forward his guns in calculated steps that took no account of casualties sustained, creeping ever closer to that inner bay. He knew, as did those he fought, that to command the entrance to the Petite Rade was to trap inside every vessel that remained. Lord Hood had reacted as he should. There were no more British or Allied ships to ensnare now. They had all upped anchor and fled to the safety of the wide outer bay known as the Grande Rade. HMS Vulcan was towing several boats, passing first a steady and departing stream of overloaded fishing and coastal trading vessels. Then, within sight of the commercial waterfront, a quay densely packed with people intent on desperate flight, people who knew what was coming with the revolutionary armies. The guillotine and the representatives on mission from the Committee of Public Safety, men driven by a bloodlust that would see it employed for day after day to decapitate those they saw as the enemy of their murderous political philosophy. "Look at them, poor souls," Michael said. As the Irishman said this, the press became so great that several of those at the front, hoping for a boat, were pushed into the water, their distressed cries echoing over the rumble of the mob. The few boats left at the quay were loading only those with the means to pay, their chattels with them if they had enough funds. Those without means were left to pray or fall. Indeed, the harbour was already awash with the floating bodies and possessions of those who had suffered and could not swim. "We should be looking to them, not setting ships afire. We's about the wrong duty." "Who speaks there?" came a loud and commanding voice. "Am I leading traitors to do their duty?" "Quiet, Michael," Pearce snapped. He knew his friend well enough to guess there would be a response, and an impolite one. Then he turned to face the officer commanding the ship, a long-serving lieutenant called Hare, whom he had only met when coming aboard that evening. "My man speaks from humanity, sir." "Humanity be damned, sir, when necessity calls. Tell him to mind his tongue, or by God he'll feel the lash when this is over." That the ship's captain meant what he said was evident by the look on his face, made more menacing by the fact that it was lit in orange and red by the flames from ashore, these reflecting off the dense low cloud as well as the still harbour water. Raging along the hills that led up to Mount Faron, the ridge that dominated the port, the fires were caused by the burning defence works, the redoubts and small forts, which had been built since the Allied fleets had taken possession of the anchorage in August. Below, the town itself was being bombarded by revolutionary cannon, setting building after building ablaze. The task set for this little flotilla was straightforward. Anything that might be of use to the besiegers, soon to be the owners of this premier naval port, was to be torched. The arsenal, the rope-walk, sail lofts, and warehouses full of stores. Given they were almost the first words Hare had addressed to John Pearce, his impression of the fellow was based only on what he could see. There was arrogance in his posture, hands behind his back, feet spread to anticipate any slight roll of the ship, and a sort of sneer on his heavily pock-marked face. "You do not see the need, sir, to offer succour to these poor unfortunates?" John Pearce should not have spoken. He knew that even as he said the words. Regardless of how he perceived his status, to take issue with a fellow officer, and one ranked as a master and commander, much senior to him in years served, was inadvisable at the best of times. And this was far from that. Yet he was incapable of allowing roughshod authority to rule his behaviour. The response was a bark. "I see the need, sir, to serve my king." "Then perhaps, sir, those of Naples and Spain are more Christian sovereigns." "Damn you, sir, what do you mean?" "I mean, sir, that if you look yonder to the outer mole, you will observe Neapolitan and Spanish warships taking off the refugees, an act which shames those like us who serve their royal cousin." Hare stalked up to him and looked Pearce right in the eye, his nose an inch away. "You dare dispute with me, sir?" Pearce held both his ground and the man's eye. "Not dispute, sir. I merely point out what I see." "Well, sir, I will take note of what you do, and if it does not satisfy, you may well find that a court decides you are not fit to hold a lieutenant's commission." "They can have it now, sir, given it is not something I value so highly that I will not speak as I find." "Gentlemen, please." said another voice, gentle but authoritative, that of their titular commander, though given he was clad in ratings clothing, check shirt and ducks, it would have been hard to identify him as a post captain. "We are not lacking in enemies to dispute with. I see no virtue in arguing amongst ourselves." "We cannot have trouble-making, Sir Sidney." The man actually laughed. "Then I am in the wrong place, Mr. Hare, for I am bent on that very thing." He then looked to the other party to the dispute. "Lieutenant, I confess I do not know your name." "Pearce, sir." "Then, Lieutenant Pearce, your concern for these poor folks is to be commended." That brought a hiss from Hare. "But so is the captain's love of duty. If we do that, which I confess must be our primary concern, perhaps then we will have time to look to our compassion." "Captain Hare, I require to be put ashore with the men designated to join me so that I may supervise the destruction of the port facilities." As he uttered those words, a cannonball landed right alongside the ship, sending up a great plume of water, which, on a windless night, rose to a great height before dropping straight back down again, soon to be followed by a second. Seeking the source, it soon became obvious that some of the vessels chosen to be destroyed were manned, and a few of their cannon were being employed to defend them. "I see the rats have emerged from their cellars," Smith said. "Toulon is full of men whose loyalty is attached to a weather vane. For the monarchy 1 minute, and the revolution now the tide has shifted. Captain Hare, I require that your guns be employed to keep those fellows honest." "With the men you propose to take ashore, sir, I am light on gun crews." "Then let us oblige, sir," said Pearce. "My men and I will happily work one of your cannon." "Well said, Mr. Pearce. Now, Captain Hare, let us have the boats alongside and see to what we are about." Pearce, Michael, Rufus, and Charlie found themselves helping to work a long 9-pounder with the rest of the gun crew, made up by a trio of men from Vulcan, and, if they were unfamiliar with each other, so common was the discipline of the Royal Navy that they were soon serving the weapon handsomely, knocking, at near point-blank range, lumps out of the enemy bulwarks and seeking to silence any counterfire. Other cannon were playing along the shore to keep the enemy clear of the route to the arsenal, or, to be more precise, those Toulonnais who had reason to seek to stop the destruction, the folk who earned their livelihoods in that facility. Already flames were beginning to lick around the major buildings, and there was the constant crack of musketry as the detachment of soldiers sent to defend the firing parties went about their duty, albeit with many a returned discharge from the French workers. Coat and hat off now, John Pearce was on the lanyard, both aiming and firing the weapon, peering through the gun port to do the former, this while the weapon was levered round and the elevation wedged at his command. He stood well clear once the gun was loaded and primed, to haul hard on his line and fire the flintlock, the discharge sending the huge lump of black metal, as well as the trunnion on which it ran, jumping back hard onto its restraining tackles. Powder monkeys raced to and from the magazine with the charges taken from the gunner, sat, hopefully safe, behind his wetted screens. This while the more useless ratings fetched balls from the lower deck storerooms to keep regular the bombardment. Much as they were playing hard on their enemies, along with the other vessels in the flotilla, the Pelicans were under return fire, and shots were striking home, either slamming into the hull and rocking the whole ship, or, aimed better, taking out great chunks of the bulwarks, or raking across the deck to land in the water behind, having sliced through rigging and ropes, while all around and beneath him there were men working flat out, still priming the ship. Pearce never knew what set off one part of that, an enemy shot striking a deadly spark, or a piece of foolishness by one of those employed in the task. All he felt was the result. The dull boom coincided with the planking beneath his feet rising up, as if forced skywards by a giant's hand. It then began to crack open as the first flames emerged with the rest of the blast. The gun they were working, just run in and unstable, tipping over onto its side on the suddenly uneven deck. He was thrown to his knees, while Michael O'Hagan was blasted backwards to roll along the deck. Rufus Dommett, a terrified look on his young freckled face, was slammed into the bulwark, while Charlie Taverner, seemingly unaffected, stood still and shocked. Then his tricorn hat went sailing through the air, and Charlie dropped down to his knees, holding his ears. John Pearce had felt the same pressure, but he was able to turn to see where the real damage had been done. The explosion had come from under the quarterdeck, at one time full of people, but now utterly empty, with the wheel gone, the front of the poop shattered, and the cabin behind it ripped open, the bulkhead shredded to expose a scene of devastation in what had been Hare's quarters. Getting to his feet with some effort, Pearce headed aft, able on the way to help raise a shocked and bewildered Michael, though in grasping to pull him up he nearly fell over himself.
"What, in the name of Holy Mary, was that?"
Michael shouted. Though all a deafened John Pearce could hear was a muffled sound that seemed distant. The ship was rocking like a seesaw, and it was with some difficulty that they made their way across the splintered planking to join men equally bewildered and equally deaf, all shouting at each other, and all unable to properly hear what was being said. Looking through the gap that had once been the starboard bulkhead, he saw in the water 2 blue coats, one on his back and another face down. There was no time for hesitation, no time to issue any orders. He just had to hope the men left standing would show some sense. Kicking off his shoes, he dived in, hitting the waters of the harbour, so cold it made him gasp. In an instant he struck out to get to the second blue coat and turn him face up, lest he drown, and as he reached him, a rope landed in the water by his arm. Looping it round the body was not easy, but Pearce did manage to get enough of a knot on the man to allow them to haul him back to the ship. That done, he swam over to where Hare lay on his back, his eyes closed, his mouth open. There was no time to see if he was alive or dead, only time to get underneath him and grasp his shoulders, then kick out for the ship's side. Hands were there as he reached the rough scantlings, ready to haul the captain out, then reach down for Pearce and help him back on deck, where he found an anxious midshipman leaning over the comatose bodies, examining them.
"They're alive!"
he yelled into the cloth ears around him, looking to see if they had heard, reassured by the eager nods. Pearce, dripping wet, was quick to realize, after a searching glance, he had to be the most senior person left aboard. He also knew that if there had been one unwanted explosion, there could very easily be a second and third which would rip them all to shreds. Issuing the orders that followed his conclusion was a nightmare of endless shouting, always facing the person he was addressing, so at least they would have his lips as an aid to comprehension. This while he got back into his shoes and his uniform coat. "Prepare a boat! We must get any wounded to Saint-Mandrier, while all the other boats are to be made ready to abandon ship." The midshipman mouthed the need to get the cannon loaded and run out, so they would go off as the fire took hold of the ship, helping to demolish whatever they were aimed at. A party had to be organized to man the relieving tackles below decks, given the ship's wheel had been shattered in the explosion. Those who could handle muskets needed to get them loaded so as to play upon the decks of the 2 capital ships between which he was going to jam HMS Vulcan, and keep them clear of renegade French sailors. "Do you know where the main fuses are to be lit?" he shouted to the midshipman, relieved when the lad nodded. "Then get to them and stand by to ignite them on my command." He turned to a quartermaster's mate, who had not been on deck at the time of the explosion, but had rushed to the station immediately it had occurred. "Stand by the companionway to shout down the orders to steer." That directive was followed by a stream of others, calling for sails to be set by men who seemed to move as slowly as bearers at a funeral. There were no specific commands. Anything that would serve to give them steerage way would do, though with no wind to speak of that led to limp and useless sails. Instructions were sent to the men who, on his orders, had piled into the boats to get up ahead and take tow. Their efforts brought round Vulcan's bowsprit, damned slowly, but round all the same, with Pearce shouting to the quartermaster's mate the orders that would ease the rudder to aid them, and once on course, to get the men from below to lash off their tackles and be ready to disembark. On shore he could see the results of what Sir Sidney Smith was about, though he could only hear muffled evidence of the explosions. The arsenal was alight from end to end, the flames seeming to lick the low clouds, creating a glow that lit up everything around the naval harbour in a sort of hellish montage. HMS Vulcan had drifted into position, the towing boats having got enough way on her to get her heading to where Pearce needed her to be, her bowsprit right between the bow and stern of a pair of French 74s. It had to be well timed. Pearce had to get himself and the remainder of the crew off the ship after the fuses were lit, but before they took hold and exploded the powder, he having no true idea of how long that was. So he ordered everyone into the boats and went below himself to join the midshipmen, who now stood over a tangle of fuses, long trails of primed cord, with a piece of slow match smouldering away in his hand. Sign language, rather than words, told Pearce that, once ignited, they would be required to run like the devil. After a nodded acknowledgment, the lad touched the fuse ends, and they immediately began to splutter and trail off in a cloud of acrid smoke, progressing towards the various charges. He and the midshipmen were no longer there. The boy was racing ahead of Pearce, taking the companionway 3 steps at a time, but he had to be grabbed and directed to where the last boat, manned by the Pelicans, lay rocking and waiting. As soon as they had one foot on the cutter, the oars were dipped and they began to pull away from the ship's side. Pearce should have sat down, but he was keen to see what the result would be, and it was impressive. HMS Vulcan went up like a volcano erupting, a great sheet of flame shooting from her deck, that followed by a boom as the powder barrels went up. It was as though she grew to twice her size for a second, but that was blotted out by the mass of flames that engulfed her, great streams of burning pitch shooting out to run along the scantlings of the French 74s, some rising high enough to set afire the standing rigging, that rapidly catching fire. Taking his naval officer's hat from Michael, who'd had the presence of mind to gather it up, Pearce jammed it on his head just as the debris from the explosion began to fall. Had he not been wearing it, the lump of wood might have done him serious harm. As it was, landing on the crown of his scraper, it was hard enough to fell him and knock him unconscious.
"Row for St. Mondrier,"
Michael O'Hagan ordered, a shout that included the boat carrying the 2 wounded officers. In doing so, he completely ignored the bemused midshipman, who should have issued any command. Chapter 2. It was a groggy John Pearce who landed on the hospital jetty, still wet from his dip in the harbour and shivering, helped by Charlie Taverner and Rufus Dommett to stand upright while his boat was secured, and the 2 wounded officers Pearce had rescued were unloaded from the other and taken to be attended to. A quarter of an hour later, inside the building, trying to dry out by the heat of a blazing fire, he was sought out by an anxious Heinrich Lutjens, the surgeon, having seen to his new patients, eager to inform him that there was as yet no sign of the transport supposed to be coming to take off the wounded, as well as those who ran the hospital. Getting a mumbled response, he demanded of Pearce's companions what was the matter. "If you look at this, you'll see, Mr. Lutjens," said Rufus, handing him a hat, the crown of which had been flattened. "Lump of timber did that, your honour." "And he'd only just donned the bugger," Charlie added. "God must love him." "Sit him down," Lutjens ordered, and once that had been done, he began to run his upright finger back and forth across Pearce's eye-line, before running his fingers through the thick hair on the top of his head. "A touch concussed for certain, but no sign of any abrasion." "Why no transport?" Pearce asked in a low voice. "I have no idea. It was promised but has yet to arrive, and I have to tell you time is of the essence. Word has come from the lieutenant manning the battery protecting us that the French may be massing for an assault, one he fears he will struggle to contain, and I would remind you the Marines too need to be taken off." Pearce heaved himself to his feet, slowly shaking his head to clear it.
"Then there is no time to sit and ponder. Charlie, where is that mid we had with us?"
"Still sat in the boat with the men from the Vulcan."
"Get him here. Heinrich, a pen and paper. I must send word to Admiral Hood and inform him that we face capture. And I would appreciate a tot of your medicinal brandy to clear my damned head. Rufus, fetch Michael. You, he, and Charlie are together, every man in this hospital who can fight or even walk, and any men in the boats not needed to row. We need bodies in that redoubt to give the French pause."
"What about you?" Lutyens asked.
"Me?"
Pearce replied, picking up his wrecked scraper.
"I need a new hat, I think. It wouldn't help if the French saw that."
"I'm sure my husband would not begrudge you his." The female voice made everyone present turn to see Emily Barclay standing in a doorway.
"With respect, madam, I think I am the last person he would wish to gift anything to."
If the pause that engendered was short, it was enough to remind those who heard the exchange that bad blood existed between Captain Ralph Barclay, her husband, and Lieutenant John Pearce. It had been Barclay who had illegally pressed the Pelicans into King George's navy. Barclay, who had survived the travesty of a recent court-martial for the offence, the verdict of which, that he was innocent of the charge, being one Pearce was determined to overturn. "Then accept it from me, sir."
"I do not think your husband would be grateful to you for that offer."
"You must leave, sir. My husband's opinions of my actions to him and I." Again, no one was minded to mention that she was discussing a relationship that had undergone much recent strain, enough for her to leave both her husband and her floating home on his ship, the frigate HMS Brilliant, and take up residence here in the hospital. They had been brought back together because Captain Barclay had ended up as a patient, having required his left arm to be removed after a musket ball shattered his elbow during a failed assault on one of Bonaparte's most dangerous batteries. Emily Barclay had not waited for a reply. She had gone to the room in which her wounded husband lay, returning his hat in her hand. "Take it, sir, I beg." Pearce had been joking about the hat, but he stepped forward to do as he was asked, not wishing to make light of her gesture. Up close he was struck, as he had been the first time he had clapped eyes on her, by her beauty. Even now, in a mob cap, a stained apron, and showing signs of a lack of sleep, she looked striking. Luminous eyes in a face of flawless skin, with just a wisp of her auburn hair escaping to stick to her cheek. The temptation for Pearce to reach out and brush it away was almost irresistible. Yet resist he must. There were too many people present.
"Is Devereux still with your husband?"
"He is."
"Then please tell him he is needed. And if he shows a mind to object, tell him he best come if he does not want his captain to end up once more a prisoner of the French."
The way she pursed her lips then amused him. Was it a reminder of the unpleasant fact of her own confinement, after HMS Brilliant had been taken in a hot frigate action off this very coast in midsummer? Or was it that Devereux probably loved her husband more than she did? He was a man Pearce loathed, a lower-deck bully who generally made the lives of those he messed alongside hell. But if his devotion to Captain Ralph Barclay was absolute, his other quality, that of being a fighter, was of more moment in the present crisis. Pearce spun round to find the young midshipman, a slip of a lad who could be no more than 15, and was probably younger, awaiting his pleasure. On the table, Lutyens had placed an inkwell, a quill, a shaker of sand, and the wax and candle necessary for the seal. Sitting down, Pearce began to write as he spoke.
"I don't know your name, lad."
"Niven, sir," the boy responded, with a distinct Scottish accent, which had Pearce wondering if he should claim national kinship. Deciding that would only delay matters, he issued his commands.
"Well, Mr. Niven, this is to go to HMS Victory. Try to get it to Lord Hood or Rear Admiral Hyde Parker, at the very least into the hands of the C&C's secretary. Do not, and I say this at your peril, be fobbed off by anyone else." The reply of, "Aye, aye, sir," was tremulously delivered. Pearce smiled. "Have no fear. You will find, young fellow, that admirals are human, and their bark is very much worse than their bite. You can command the boat crew, I hope?" "I can, sir." "Then go, and Godspeed." As the boy dashed out of the room, Pearce wondered, not for the first time, about a service that entrusted so much to people so young. Had he died or been incapacitated in that explosion, a lad like Niven would have taken command, and no doubt have done his duty. He was also aware that his head was throbbing like the devil, but that had to be set aside. "Heinrich, I need some dry clothing, and I want the use of anything that can pass as a weapon, down to the meanest broom handle. Meanwhile, make sure everyone we do not take with us is ready to leave, for when that ship arrives we must embark with haste, lest the French come on our tail when we spike the cannon and abandon the redoubt." "They will not harm the wounded, surely?" "When it comes to the revolution," Pearce replied grimly, for he had had more experience of its terrors than most, "I would not want to discount any barbarity." Midshipman Toby Burns, not much older than Niven, sat alone in the midshipman's berth of HMS Britannia, noting the passing of time through several bells, alternately fingering the dispatch he'd been given to convey and the bandage he still wore around his head. Handed to him by Admiral Sir William Hotham in person, he wondered at the quietly delivered order that went with the written communication, the intimation that it was not to be immediately delivered. He knew what it contained, given he had been present when the Admiral dictated the contents to his clerk. An instruction to the commander of HMS Hinslip, an empty transport, presently lying no more than a cable's length from the flagship, to proceed to the St. Mondrian Peninsula, and once there to take off combatants and non-combatants alike. It was that which was said afterwards, when the clerk had departed the great cabin, that hinted at trouble.
"It would be best, Mr. Burns, if this were delayed for several hours. I trust you will see to it."
Toby Burns could still sense Hotham's breath on his cheek as the Admiral leant close to whisper those words. The look in Hotham's eye when he stepped back again was one that implied Burns would understand the need, but he was not absolutely sure he did, and that rendered him fearful. Not the brightest of young men, he nevertheless knew, even if he could not discern the purpose, when he was being used. He also worried that someone would enter this berth and ask what the devil he was doing here, skulking, given every other midshipman in the fleet had been sent away and was now occupied in some harrowing duty to do with the evacuation. Quickly he checked his bandage again, to ensure it had not slipped from his head. It would be fatal if anyone saw there was no wound underneath. The subterfuge was necessary, given Toby Burns carried a hero's reputation, gained when this new war was barely 2 months old. He knew only too well it was based on false evidence. Indeed, it was a status that had come to hang like a weight around his neck. He was expected to be brave and reckless, when in truth he shied away from conflict of any kind. There was a brief flash of anger as he imagined himself telling Sir William Hotham to do his own dirty work. But that did not last. Dread of a tongue-lashing resurfaced all too speedily. Locked in his own gloom, he dreamt, as he had for months, of being free of the King's Navy. Before joining, sea service was something he had seen in the romantic light in which it was always portrayed. How different the reality from the tales with which he had grown up, of glory and pride in naval service within England's wooden walls. He only had to look around the grubby berth, this being a flagship, an overcrowded home to 24 midshipmen, had only to smell the bilge that permeated the whole ship, to recoil from the rats that infested the lower decks, or eat the monotonous diet, and reflect on the character of the men he shared it with, be they mids, officers, or ratings, to know the depth and inaccuracy of the myth. The screen that shut off the berth from the orlop deck was pulled back, and there stood another vision to render worthless any romance, the skinny young urchin who went by the title of mess steward. A youngster who never went on deck unless ordered, and certainly avoided fresh air when it rained. He was as black as ever with the filth that covered him from head to foot, dirt ingrained into his very pores.
"What the devil do you want?"
Burns demanded in a harsh tone, for if he was fearful of those who were his naval or physical superiors, he was not one to show any kindness to a creature below him in the pecking order. "Nowt," the lad replied, showing white uneven teeth that only accentuated his dirty face, a part of him only marginally cleaner than the sleeve with which he constantly wiped it.
"Come to rummage, I dare say, while the berth is empty," Burns snapped.
"Well, you can carry on for all I care. I have nothing left to steal. All my supposed shipmates have beaten you to it."
"I ain't a thief," the lad protested. "I came to tidy."
"Then," Burns barked, standing up, "you are singular in this vessel."
"What's you about, then?"
"None of your damn business," Burns said, pushing past him.
Head down, angry and sick of this imposed prevarication, he made his way up to the main deck and along to the entry port, calling to the 6th lieutenant of the ship, the man on duty, that he required a boat.
"Require, sir? Require?"
Beddoes inquired with an arch expression.
"What day is it that a midshipman requires from a commissioned officer?" "I carry a dispatch."
"So you say, Burns," the officer growled, interrupting him.
"But carrying a dispatch, if indeed you are, does not mean you give up all manners and all courtesy to rank." "I require a boat, sir." "Better, young man, but I think I need a please, as well as a couple of fingers to your hat. And I think I must tell Admiral Hotham how much you facilitated his instructions."
Terrified of the words he had used, which, due to his underlying anger, had come out unbidden, Burns was about to apologize. But then he saw the change of expression on the 6th lieutenant's face. It went from hauteur to fright in a flash.
"You are on an errand for the Admiral?" "I am,"
Burns replied, before adding in a way that threw caution to the winds,
"and a most pressing one that you delay, sir, at some peril to your position."
The feeling he had then, as Beddoes rushed to call in a boat, manned by poor unfortunates obliged to lay off the ship in the cold and swell for this very eventuality, made him feel warm for the first time in an age. The 6th lieutenant might not outrank him by much, had he not been a midshipman himself until only a few months previously. But he had the power to evoke the Admiral, the ability to induce fear, and that made him top dog. He almost cooed his next words.
"I will be sure to tell Sir William how you reacted with such alacrity, sir, once you were apprised of his interest." "Obliged, Mr. Burns, much obliged."
"Damn it, what is the man about?"
yelled Lord Hood. Aimed at the captain of the fleet, Rear Admiral Hyde Parker, it had a terrible effect on young Mr. Niven, who visibly began to shake in his shoes.
"Part of the orders I gave at 6 bells this morning was to get HMS Hinslip to San Mondrian with all dispatch. Everyone should be off the peninsula by now."
Parker, round and smooth of face in contrast to his craggy grey-haired superior, felt the need to look put out. Yet he was far from that, this being just another example of Sir William Hotham, Lord Hood's second-in-command, acting to thwart his superior's wishes. As the administrative officer of the fleet, he not only had onerous duties to perform in keeping it up to scratch, he was required to act as a lightning rod for the C&C.
"God rot the fellow!"
Hood barked, before he cast an eye back to the shivering Niven.
"What's amiss with you, lad? Got the ague?"
"No, sir. Begging your pardon, sir."
"Well, there's something amiss with you."
"Perhaps he fears to be yelled at," said Parker.
"Who's yelling at him?"
Hood bellowed.
"I suspect he thinks you are, my lord."
"Don't stop shaking, lad. I don't bite."
Hood then furiously waved Pearce's letter, his voice rising once more.
"Excepting when a poltroon does his best to make a fool out of me."
"I think it would be best to act, my lord. Loss of temper will not serve." The eyebrows came down to a glower.
"Mind your manners, Parker. Remember who you were addressing."
"Of course, my lord," Parker replied, not in the least contrite.
"You see what I have to put up with, lad?"
Hood asked a still quivering Niven, his voice gruff but low.
"No respect from men who should know better. I dare say you know how to obey an order. You eaten at all?"
"Yes, sir. Dinner, sir."
"Dinner? That was hours ago. See that chafing dish on the table yonder?"
The boy nodded, his eye drawn to the highly polished mahogany of a dining table set with several silver dishes, one of which had a small candle underneath.
"There's sausages in there, French, mind, and 2 full of garlic for my taste. But filling. Help yourself."
Niven did not move until Hood added,
"Do you know how to obey an order, boy?"
Hood watched as the youngster approached the table in a wary fashion, amused by the way he gingerly opened the dish, but that diffidence did not survive the smell that greeted him. Hood had to actually suppress a laugh as he saw Niven began to stuff his mouth to the point where speech would have been impossible.
"Never met a mid that weren't starving," he said.
The humour evaporated when he looked back at Hyde Parker, again waving the letter.
"This is downright insubordination."
"I agree, my lord, but it is an indication of how Admiral Hotham feels about the strength of his position." Hood began to pace back and forth, evidence of his mood audible by the growling noise emanating from his throat. His political master, King George's first minister, William Pitt, trying to hold together a fractious coalition, one that would wholeheartedly prosecute the war with revolutionary France, had warned him to be guarded with Hotham, who had friends amongst the faction known as the Portland Whigs. Indeed, the leader of that group, the Duke of Portland, was a strong supporter of Hotham, and would no doubt like to see him in command of the Mediterranean fleet. Hood was a Tory from his greying locks to his silver shoe buckles, and had been a member of Pitt's government, the senior naval lord on the Board of Admiralty, before the outbreak of hostilities. He hated Whigs, and of that entire breed he hated the slimy Sir William Hotham the most. But he was hamstrung by instructions, which had come to him by a private and secret letter from Downing Street, delivered to him by the man who had written the note he was holding, Lieutenant John Pearce. Abruptly he stopped both his pacing and his growling to look at the signature appended to the message young Niven had brought him.
"Ain't Pearce charged with clearing the wounded from the hospital?"
Parker nodded, which received a knowing look from his superior.
"And then he's supposed to be on his way back to England."
"I believe, sir, the idea was that, with the evacuation complete, he would take passage on the first available ship with his companions, the men he calls the Pelicans." Hood moved closer to Parker, looking over his shoulder to ensure the midshipman was still intent on filling his face, before speaking softly.
"Would Hotham go to such lengths to dish one man, Parker, and interfere with my orders?"
Hood's captain of the fleet declined to reply to that, though his look was significant.
"Strikes me only London can deal with Hotham. And it also strikes me that we have, taking passage home if we can get him off in time, the very fellow to go back to Billy Pitt with my concerns."
"Unofficially," said Parker.
"You know I dare not damn the sod in my official communications. They are read to the Cabinet. But a private letter—"
Hood stood slightly hunched, thinking for a moment, before calling to Niven.
"You, lad, what ship are you in?"
"Windsor Castle, my lord," Niven replied, wiping a greasy set of lips on his sleeve.
"To which you should now proceed."
"Yes, sir."
"Well, you won't be. I've a chore for you. I dare say your captain will not mind if I bother you for a bit. Parker, I need your help in this, you being better at the political game than ever I will be."
"I'm not sure I take that as a compliment, my lord."
"It ain't," hooted Hood. "It's as close to damnation as it comes. We must get an order direct to HMS Hinslip to weigh for St. Mondrian immediately, to supersede any instructions to the contrary. Then I need you to help me compose a true account of affairs in this command for our political master." "Might I remind you, my lord, you require Pearce to agree to both carry and see it delivered. He might refuse." "Refuse?" Hood barked. "I'll see him keel-hauled if he tries."
Niven, his belly full, sat on the footlockers that lay below the line of 9 casement windows that ran the full width of HMS Victory's stern, marvelling at the space and the accoutrements afforded to the high and mighty. A sleeping cabin and a personal privy, a public cabin and a private one that could be combined to entertain several dozen people, the room to walk about, good furniture and even paintings, which stood in contrast to his own meagre berth, a cubbyhole aboard HMS Windsor Castle, shared with a dozen of his fellow mids. He was enthralled. This was worth working for, worth risking life and limb to achieve, and it took no great leap of his tender imagination to see himself striding back and forth across the checkered canvas that lined the floor, as Lord Hood was doing now, dictating something to the fatter admiral. How grand it must be to have someone of such high rank to write your letters for you. When they'd finished, Hood strode back and forth once more, handling without effort the swell of the ship, reading in his hand a letter of several pages, while Admiral Parker penned another. That finished, Niven was called for and handed the second missive.
"You are to return to Lieutenant Pearce and give him this, and tell him I beg he read it, which has an order that he attend on me as soon as possible, and the reason therein. Now, having done that, he may well say words to the effect that he is damned if he will. You will then pass to him this verbal message with my authority. If he refuses my request, I will haul him and his so-called pelicans into the first ship I can find and send them off to the East Indies. Have you got that, boy?"
"Yes, sir," Niven replied nervously.
"Then repeat it."
He had to be coached, and he stumbled over the words several times, but eventually Hood was satisfied that he had the threat off pat.
"Right, young fellow. On your way back to St. Mondrian, and be assured I will inform your captain of your exemplary conduct. You're a credit to the service."
Niven nearly made 5 foot as he stretched in gratitude. Chapter 3. Wrapped in his boat cloak, at least in dry breeches, Pearce led his party of pelicans, vulcans, and barely ambulant men, 24 in number, out of the tiny fishing port of St. Mondrian, heading towards the neck of the peninsula, to the earthwork redoubt which had been thrown up to house the battery of 4 cannon facing the French counterpart on the mainland. The crossing of the wooded hill in between was hard going, and required the likes of Devereux and Michael O'Hagan to assist some of the patients. But once the summit had been reached, things eased somewhat as they headed downhill, and on the flat and narrow spit the going was good. With him, to see them through the darkness and the wooded paths, he had brought flaming torches soaked in pitch. Yet they had a double purpose. He hoped they would serve to tell the enemy, if they were gathering for an assault, that rather than being abandoned, the redoubt was being reinforced. At all costs it had to be held till that transport arrived, and Pearce was acutely conscious it would not be only the likes of the Barclays who would face captivity if this bluff didn't work. He and his friends would, too. A party of Marines under a Lieutenant Driffield manned the battery. Pearce, being naval, outranked the Lobster, but there was no accepting responsibility when the fellow, with palpable relief, tried to pass on to him the supervision of the position. As Pearce was quick to point out, he was here to bluff, not to fight. Having climbed to the top of the earthwork and seen nothing but the fires of the French encampment, he had retreated back to ground level to enjoy the heat of the blazing bonfire that lit up the British position. "Give me the situation?" he asked. "We have been here for months with practically no activity, but as of yesterday men have been filing into Les Sablettes. Seeing Pearce raise a flame-illuminated eyebrow at the name, Driffield explained,
"That's what the Crappos call their position, which at least has the virtue of being a reference to its geographical name. This Bonaparte fellow everyone's talking about is much given to romance when it comes to christening his creations. He named one the Battery of Men Without Fear, in French, that heathen tongue, of course."
A fluent French speaker, John Pearce forbore to point out that to the men of Les Sablettes, the heathens were defending this redoubt.
"Your Bonaparte fellow is also much given to outflanking and suppressing our guns, Mr. Driffield,
which is why we're being obliged to abandon Toulon."
"Do you think they will attack soon?"
"Only if they're mad, sir. It is flat open ground, narrow, with sea on both sides, and we have 4 cannon loaded with grape, which anyone leading them would reckon to be the case. No, they will either try to suppress us with shot and shell, to dismount our guns and break up the protective embankment, or they will gather boats and seek to get round behind us. You coming up, and the sight of your torches, may well give them pause."
"As long as they have no sight of the unfortunates bearing them."
Driffield pulled a face. Even in the poor light he could see that several of those present were wounded men. 2 sat in front of the tents that housed his marines were missing arms, while another, who had insisted on joining, had had a leg removed, though some time previously, since then becoming, with his wooden peg, a sort of orderly in the hospital.
"What is the likelihood of boats?" Pearce asked,
aware that if they could outflank this battery, they could very well go right on to the hospital jetty.
"Oh, they will be cautious there, sir, for it is where we have all the advantage. The smallest of our warships could sink them, and once they're out in the bay they'd be sitting ducks."
"What preparations are there for disabling the guns?"
"Spikes are ready, and I've rigged lines to overturn the carriages, alongside sledgehammers to shatter the wheels. I would double or triple shot the barrels and seek to blast them, but that would endanger my own men. Besides, these are new cannon and have not been fired much, so they're still very sound."
"Good. I take it you have ample food."
"Only if we are not to be here too long."
"I don't think we will be, Lieutenant Driffield.
Either we'll be hot-footing it back to the hospital, or we'll be hauling up a white flag. Let's get everyone fed, and I, for one, could use some sleep."
"Oh, I have commandeered a fisherman's hut, sir, which I am happy to share, and though it is not luxurious, it is at least shelter."
"Pickets?"
2 hours on, 4 off, and set for the night, sir. I will make sure they stay alert."
"Good," John Pearce replied, feeling as he often did like a military fraud. This marine would know more than him about both attack and defence, though he might match him in gunnery. That was because Driffield wanted to be in his chosen profession, one into which John Pearce had been forced.
"We must be up at cockscrow and get a look at their preparations."
"What is actually happening in Toulon, sir?"
"Oh, surely you've looked across the anchorage, Lieutenant, and seen for yourself."
The marine looked past Pearce to the distant flames engulfing much of the furthest part of the port, made more hellish by being reflected in the calm Black Sea. The arsenal and naval warehouses were located there, while individual fires were raging, flickering points of red and orange light all along the harbour frontage, leaving Pearce, when he chose to look, to wonder at the fate of all those people he had seen lining the quays. Just then a huge explosion rent the air, sending up hundreds of feet into the night sky a sheet of bright flame as well as visible debris. Seconds later they felt the blast, much diminished, but at such a distance evidence of its stunning power.
"Well, what the devil was that?" Driffield demanded.
"There are a pair of French frigates in the harbour full of powder,"
Pearce said, knowing this from Sir Sidney Smith's briefing.
"We were supposed to sail them out, and I doubt we have succeeded with at least one of them."
"We are safer here, Mr. Pearce, I reckon."
"Let's hope you are right." Tobias Sidey, captain of the fleet transport HMS Hinslip, had seen the same explosion, and, being closer to the seat of it, felt even more the blast. He weighed as soon as he got the order to do so, or, to be more precise, 2 sets of orders telling him to do exactly the same thing, a verbal one from Lord Hood, and another from Sir William Hotham, that being a normal written instruction. The message from Victory, however, left him in no doubt of the need for extreme haste. On a windless night, to obey such a command was a tall order. The sails, once dropped and sheeted home, hung limp, flapping occasionally as a slight zephyr did something to trouble the canvas. Toby Burns was standing off, on his way back to HMS Britannia, wondering if he should tell Admiral Hotham of the renewed orders from Lord Hood, and deciding on silence, when Captain Sidey put his own boats in the water and began the wearisome task of towing his ungainly ship towards the St. Mondrier Peninsula, a vessel he knew would be too deep of draught to enter the inlet in which the hospital jetty lay. Those same boats would be required to take off the people he was tasked to collect, and the whole could be at risk of fire from the enemy batteries, if they'd been pushed far enough forward. At the same time, Midshipman Niven was arriving at that very jetty in search of Lieutenant John Pearce, only to be told that he would have to traverse the hills to the west in order to go and find him. Bolstered by the good opinion of the Commander-in-Chief, and still feeling well fed, he set off with enthusiasm, soon plunging into the Stygian darkness of the wooded hillside, struggling to stay on the path, and losing his way more than once. Emily Barclay sat by her husband's bed, really that of Heinrich Lutyens, which he had first given to her when she had left HMS Brilliant, a couchette she had passed on to her husband after his amputation, the ever-faithful Devereux carrying him from the operating table. He had been unconscious then, through a combination of laudanum and shock, but had since fallen victim to a dangerous fever. She was obliged to frequently mop his sweating brow, and wipe off the excessive perspiration caused by both his condition and the heat from the blazing fire in the grate. He was also called upon to press down hard on his remaining right arm to restrain him from time to time, as whatever deep dream he was experiencing made him wrestle with his demons. To be sitting here, nursing this man, was to induce in her a series of deeply ambivalent feelings. Captain Ralph Barclay, 20 years her senior, was her husband, but she had come to comprehend she had agreed to marry him as much to satisfy family needs as through any affection. Indeed, she knew now that the pressure from her parents as to the suitability of the match had probably weighed more heavily on her than she had realized at the time, flattered as she was by the attentions of such a person, a seeming man of the world, who had all the gravitas of his 37 years and his senior naval rank. Ralph Barclay had not turned out to be a man of the world after all. He had proved to be both given to falsehood and to be a narrow-minded naval officer, a post-captain of more than 3 years' seniority, and one who abided religiously by the codes of a profession known to be harsh. At home in Somerset, he had seemed avuncular and wise, but once aboard his ship he had been exposed as a hard-horse captain, and one with whom she had come to dispute. What she saw as cruelty, he saw as taught discipline, and more recently she had been given cause to question both his character and his probity, all of that overlaid by what appeared to be blatant and shameless avarice. While she had accepted on their wedding day her new husband was not rich, Emily had no idea of how pushed he was for funds, given he had no ship and the country was at peace. Ralph Barclay had been obliged for 5 whole years to live on half pay, a stipend that not only supported him but also his 2 twittering older sisters. Only slowly had she realized how much she had needed to avoid the pressing demands of the local tradesmen. Certainly the joy of getting a frigate at the outbreak of the war had been exciting, but she had watched with some trepidation how difficult it had been for him to pay for the very necessary things required to properly carry out his duties. The food and wine to entertain, the new uniforms, and items of basic furniture needed to turn his cabin into something approaching comfort. She also knew, now, he had taken her to sea with him, in truth a breach of regulations, though much ignored, in order to avoid the expense of maintaining his new wife in her own household. Even ignorant of the rules which governed the behaviour of naval officers, Emily Barclay was aware her husband had stretched them to and beyond their limits. She had seen the pressed men brought aboard at Sheerness, some bearing the effects of being taken by force, and had, out of loyalty, held her tongue when she heard them described as volunteers, and averted her gaze when they were painfully struck with a starter, a short, knotted rope. The taking of a couple of prizes, won in a very questionable way, might have eased the financial concerns, but Ralph Barclay's behaviour continued to trouble her, the whole coming to a head at his recent court-martial. She had sat through that, and had heard the lies uttered by not only him, but also her nephew, Midshipman Toby Burns. The likes of Devereux and her husband's slimy clerk, Cornelius Gerson, uttering falsehoods, bothered her, not for the fact that they were spoken, but more by the certain knowledge that it was her husband who had induced them to lie to support his case. All these thoughts piled in on her and swirled in her mind. What she did not have was a solution as to how they were going to affect her future. "My dear, you must get some sleep." She had not heard the door open. In fact, she suspected she had drifted off into a reflective, if troubled, doze, aided by the heat of the fire. "I will sleep here in the chair." Seeing Lutyens frown, she added, nodding to the bed, "He has to be restrained, as he is much troubled in his fever, hardly still. If he pulls out the ligature, it may lead to an infection." Lutyens approached the bed and bent to sniff at the piece of thin cord which protruded from the angry wound of the stump, where once there had been an elbow. Once the mortified flesh had healed around it, to the point where it and the swab attached to it could be easily pulled free, that would indicate the arm was healed. "I smell no corruption," he said, "and the fever will pass or carry him off in the next day. It will hardly serve if you make yourself ill in the same period." Did she want the fever to carry him off? For that would solve the dilemma of her present discontent. That she had never loved this fevered man she now knew. The emotions she had felt as a 17-year-old bride had more to do with admiration and respect. Also, Emily had been raised to think, as had most girls of her age and class, that security was a better grounding for a happy life than deep passion. Yet she was not, again like her contemporaries, immune to the dream of a great romance. Had she and her girlfriends not speculated endlessly on such a thing every time they gathered in a group, imagining some Prince Charming would come and carry them away to a life of connubial bliss in a sparkling palace? How Emily wished Lutyens, in his insensitive way, had not said those words. What was it that made a man of such a tender and sympathetic character as he was become so brusque when it came to matters medical or the prospect of death? Did he have any idea of the train of her thoughts? Did he know that part of her very being, fighting with her deep sense of duty, longed to be free of an attachment which had revealed itself to be founded on sand?
End of CD 1. CD 2.
"Mr. Lutyens, sir?"
"Yes."
The ship's boy, a recovering patient who had fallen from the rigging of his vessel and broken an arm, was hanging round the door.
"There be a big bugger of a ship."
"Mind your language,"
Lutyens snapped. Emily just hid a smile. Once she would have been shocked to be witness to such blaspheming, but months aboard her husband's frigate had cured her of the touchy hearing of her more tender years.
"Saving your presence, Mrs. Barclay, but there's a ship a-warping into the entrance of the bay, being towed like, and I reckon it has come for us."
Just then they heard the sound of the second massive explosion of that night, albeit the exterior walls of the building muffled the sound and fury. Captain Ralph Barclay sat bolt upright, eyes open and blazing, throwing out his good right arm, finger pointed straight at the doorway, his voice at top pitch as he shouted, "Seize him and tie him to the grating! He'll feel the lash, or I'll see him damned!"
"Holy Christ in heaven!"
cried the boy as he fled from that accusing finger. Emily was on her feet in a flash, speaking in soothing tones, pressing her husband back onto his pillows.
"The fever approaches crisis," Lutyens said, "but I must see to this ship, and if it is our transport, send word to Lieutenant Pearce."
"The damned cheek of the man," Pearce said, as he read in the gloomy morning light the letter from Lord Hood, in which he was required to call upon the Admiral to receive private letters which must be returned to London and William Pitt. "Does he think I'm his valet?" Midshipman Niven, who, covered in scratches and earth, looked in the cold light of dawn as if he had been dragged through a hedge backwards, was shocked, given he knew to whom Pearce was referring. But he did not utter the words he had been coached to say, simply because the man to whom he would have to address them looked angry enough to box his ears for his temerity. "Is there any other message, Mr. Niven?"
"Only, sir, that Lord Hood was most anxious you do him a service."
Weighing the letter in his hand, Pearce was minded to tell Hood to go to the devil, yet he was also aware that there might be some advantage in this. He needed to get Ralph Berkeley into a court of King's Bench on a charge of perjury, and he had the evidence of the lies to make his case, falsehoods which had been aired at the travesty of a court-martial set up by his patron, Admiral Hotham. Lord Hood, as his payment for a previously rendered service, had gifted him sight of the entire transcript, and allowed him time and the means to make a fair copy. Yet he had few illusions as to how difficult it would be to get Ralph Berkeley into the dock. The Navy, or rather the Admiralty, always defended the press gang, and would very likely seek to protect one of their own. Berkeley was politically insignificant, so those in power would do nothing to advance Pearce's cause. Yet here he was being offered an entree into the highest office in the land outside that of the monarch himself. The letter Hood referred to would likely guarantee him a private audience, and, given Hood was a strong supporter of Pitt's government, the King's First Minister might very well see the need to repay the favour on the Admiral's behalf. At the very least, it could do his cause no harm. "Very well," he said, more to himself than to the midshipman, as he pushed the letter into one of his deep pockets. "Is there anything else, Mr. Niven?"
"HMS Hinslip should be on its way, sir. Lord Hood was most irate that it did not come already."
"So, young fellow, with the folk at the hospital."
"Seems he gave the order yesterday at 6 bells in the morning watch, and he was raging that it had not been obeyed."
"Gave the order to whom?"
Niven's tongue was suddenly trapped in the corner of his mouth, evidence of contemplation. "I think it must have been to Admiral Hotham, sir. There was another mid came to Hinslip with the earlier order, and I heard his boat being hailed as from Britannia."
Pearce just grunted. Hotham would not have known he had left St. Mondrier to aid the Toulon evacuation, while he knew very well how he stood in that quarter. He was seen as a menace, or perhaps even more, a danger, for if he could get a conviction against Berkeley, there would be repercussions that would affect the man's superior. "Back to the hospital, Mr. Niven, and tell them to send us a messenger as soon as the ship arrives."
"French are stirring, John boy,"
Michael O'Hagan called softly from the top of the earthwork where he lay, only the tip of his curly-haired head showing above the parapet.
"Might be an idea to rouse out that marine."
"Oh, let him sleep yet, Michael," Pearce replied, crawling up to join him. "He was up half the night checking on the pickets, not to mention all the fireworks from over yonder." Reaching into his pocket, Pearce produced a small spyglass, property of the slumbering Driffield, and aimed it at the French position. He could see the men lining up, moving away from the embers of their nighttime fires with no great elan. A motley bunch in no recognizable uniform, instead clad in a variety of garments, the only common feature the red, white and blue cockades on their various headpieces. The sky, a uniform grey, doing nothing to render such adornments colourful. Yet he was very soon aware that he too was under observation from a short fellow out in front, in a long blue greatcoat and a fore and aft hat worn crosswise, it too with a huge tricolor cockade at the brim. He also had a proper telescope to his eye.
"Do you see him, Michael?"
Pearce said, passing the little telescope.
"He must be the fellow in command."
Peering through the glass, Michael scoffed.
"There's not much to see, John boy, given he's a short arse. I could piss over him and he'd only feel the drips."
Looking around in the morning light at a prospect new to him, Pearce took in the narrow, scrub-covered spit of land before him, a mixture of stunted dark green bushes and sand, the whole barely above sea level, and the still grey sea visible on both banks. Driffield was right. It would be a murderous piece of ground across which to mount an assault. His eyes ranging further on, Pearce spotted something of a different hue to the southwest, newly disturbed earth. Taking back the little spyglass, he examined it with some concentration, sure that what he was seeing were the outlines of an embankment of the kind raised to protect artillery. If it was another battery, and it had cannon in place, it was one that could enfilade the British position and render it untenable. What to do? This had to be held until the hospital was abandoned, or...
"Mr. Driffield," he said to the sleepy Marine a few minutes later, "you said nothing about that artillery position over yonder."
Taking the glass, the Marine followed the line of Pearce's finger, and once he'd adjusted the magnification, he swore.
"By damn, we've been humbugged. That's new." "Is that position as dangerous as I think it is?"
"Well, lethal if it is manned and equipped, sir, for we cannot withstand the shot that two separate batteries can pour into us, especially from that angle of fire, and hope to reply effectively. We would be obliged to shift fire from the causeway as well, and we would need round shot to seek to suppress this new fella, which would reduce the effect of our grape shot and make an infantry attack very much easier."
"As I suspected," Pearce replied.
"How in the name of the devil did they get it up without us seeing anything?"
"Don't take it to heart," Pearce replied, peering at that solitary figure in the pale blue greatcoat, who was still examining them.
"Their artillery specialist has done it all over the perimeter. Do you think that might be the very fellow standing there?"
Swinging the glass round, Driffield replied,
"It could be. He's certainly a new face to me."
"How long could we hold, given this situation?"
Driffield looked at him strangely, and it was clear he saw no need for the question, just as Pearce suspected he was supposed to know the answer.
"I ask only for clarification."
"Oh, sense dictates we spike the guns now, sir, and run, if we do not wish to be buried in the earth we threw up to protect ourselves, to then be bayoneted, if we still have breath."
Pearce's response was acerbic.
"With the less-than-fit men I brought up last night, that is not an attractive option."
"My Marines and I can hold for a time, Lieutenant Pearce, but we will spill much of our blood doing so."
"Bravely said, Mr. Driffield, but hardly a pleasant alternative."
"Which is a necessary one, sir."
"No," Pearce snapped. "Michael, find me something white and a pole to attach it to."
"You are planning to surrender?"
Driffield demanded, clearly shocked.
"No, Mr. Driffield. I am planning to talk."
Chapter 4. Making his way forward, Pearce could not avoid observing the smoke rising from the town of Toulon, his eye drawn to the tall and very obvious masts of ships still in the harbour, wondering why they had not been destroyed. The operation of the previous night, a joint Spanish and British affair, had that as its purpose, to render useless, by burning, the remaining elements of the French fleet before they could fall into revolutionary hands. If those masts were still visible, it was likely the hulls beneath them were also intact, which would mean that somehow the exploit had failed. For all he might like to, he could not continue to look at that and wonder. He must deal with what was at hand. Being tall, John Pearce had been acutely aware since reaching adulthood that, when it came to relations with his shorter brethren, it was best, if he had no desire to cause an upset, not to stand too close, lest in towering over them he set their hackles to rise. The man he was approaching, Michael O'Hagan and the truce flag at his heels, was small of stature anyway and slim of build, but that was accentuated by his bicorn hat, and even more by his open greatcoat, long enough to touch the toe-caps of his knee-length boots. Underneath that he wore a uniform jacket over white breeches, with tabs identifying him as an officer of artillery. Behind him, in ragged lines, stood the unkempt French infantry, muskets at the rest, with another cockaded officer bearing a sword at their head, this one with a tricolour sash as well. To the rear of that stood the redoubt of Les Sablettes, with the snouts of 6 cannons poking out through the sandbagged embrasures.
"I hope in this white flag lark, John boy, we will not be putting ourselves at the same risk as the last time."
Pearce smiled.
"You're not frightened of a few Frenchmen, are you?"
"No, bejesus, it is you who scares me."
Close enough for the laugh that induced to be seen and heard by the man they were approaching, it got a raised eyebrow, added to a look of curiosity in the dark eyes. Pearce reckoned, from what he could see of the fellow's olive skin colour, that he was a citizen of the southern part of France. And he was young, younger than he appeared from a distance. Stopping well away from him, he spoke in French to name himself and his rank, noticing as he did so that another French officer had come forward to stand a few paces behind what had to be his superior, albeit he looked to be the younger of the two.
"Why have you come under that flag?
To whom am I speaking?
Does it matter?"
Arrogant little sod, Pearce thought, but he did not let that thought colour his speech. He kept his tone neutral, while also registering that the fellow had a strange accent to an ear schooled in Paris. "It helps to know."
"It may help you, monsieur."
Pearce looked past the diminutive fellow to the other older officer, and received for his pains a look of utter disdain.
"Well, we have come to prevent a useless effusion of blood."
"Yours?"
"Not only ours, monsieur," Pearce replied, jerking his head towards the spit of land he had just crossed, flat and featureless.
"Your men cannot cross that without suffering many casualties."
"From your cannon?"
"Yes. I might destroy them before they are obliged to even leave their positions."
"You will have noticed, monsieur, that the position has been reinforced. I brought forward a party of soldiers last night. I presume you saw our torches. Each has a musket, and is well trained to use it." That got a sneer.
"Are they prepared to die where they stand?"
Suddenly Pearce recalled what Driffield had said about the way the French artillery commander was naming his batteries. He dropped his pleasant manner and spoke in a determined tone.
"It is not only your country who can produce men without fear. They will stand if I say they will stand, and so will I."
"So you are a brave man, Lieutenant Pearce."
"I know how to do my duty, monsieur."
Shortass, as Michael had continued to name him, turned to quietly talk to his older confrère, which gave the Irishman a chance to ask how they were faring. Pearce, not knowing if they could be overheard or if either of these French officers spoke English, just shook his head. This as the smaller fellow turned back to speak to him.
"And you propose?"
"Our position was constructed to defend the Ile Saint-Mandrier and the hospital put upon it."
That point raised a smile on what was actually quite a handsome face.
"Not to mention the approach to Toulon harbour from the southwest."
True as that was, Pearce ignored it.
"As of this moment, we are awaiting the arrival of a transport to remove the wounded from the hospital, and as soon as that is complete, my instructions are to follow them aboard and abandon the place."
Suddenly a loud cheer came from the British redoubt, and Pearce, looking towards it, could see a nipper with his arm in a sling running towards them. He obviously had a message, and there could only be one that could cause such excitement. Pearce waved at him to go back to safety.
"I think that moment may have arrived, monsieur,"
he said, facing the Frenchman once more.
"My colleague here, eager for glory, wishes to drive you into the sea."
Pearce looked past the speaker to the other officer, taller and grisly-looking, who had in his eye the glare of the revolutionary fanatic.
"Then tell him that I will ensure every musket is trained on him as soon as he gets within range. I'm sure his tombstone will tell those who gaze upon it he died a glorious death. You and I will know it was a foolish and unnecessary one."
The head dropped, and Pearce found himself looking at the top of the bicorn hat. Clearly the man was examining the possibilities. Suddenly the head came back up again, the voice sharp. "You have 1 hour, monsieur, to abandon your position." The other fellow started to protest, but Short-Ass held up his hand to silence him. "You will, however, leave the guns. My colleague here can have the glory of capturing them. Do you agree?" "Yes, you have my word on that. But you do not wish that honour for yourself?" The eyes lit up then, as did the face, and the accent, which Pearce could still not place, was even more pronounced. "What are a few cannon, monsieur, when I have kicked the whole Allied force out of Toulon?" "Would your name be Bonaparte, by any chance?" The question was wasted, for the recipient had already spun on his feet to limp away, leaving Pearce to wonder if he might be carrying a wound. Calling over his shoulder, "1 hour!" Driffield looked positively petulant when Pearce told him what had happened. "It is a disgrace to leave the guns, sir." "It would be even more of a disgrace to die here to save them, and I would point out to you we have no way to remove them." "Oh, let us at least spike them, Mr. Pearce." "Mr. Driffield, I take responsibility, and I gave my word. You may tell your fellow Marines that I ordered you to leave them." "What about the powder?" Driffield demanded, pointing towards the planking-covered trench in which the barrels had been stored to protect them from heated shot, on top of which, for added security, was laid the ammunition for the cannon, barrels of grape and piles of round shot. "It was not mentioned, so you can salve your military conscience by blowing it up. Now, I must get my fellows out of here immediately, given they will take a lot longer to get back to the hospital jetty than your own. Strike your tents and gather your equipment, Mr. Driffield, but do not delay, for there is a fellow over yonder who is dying to thrust his sword blade into someone. Michael, Charlie, Rufus, Deveno, gather up our charges and let's be on our way." He looked back at the nipper with the broken arm. "You, lad, run back and tell them we're coming, and they must, at all costs, wait for us." Driffield delayed giving the orders that would see the camp struck. Instead, he watched as the stumbling patients made their way up the hill that blocked off the small fishing port from the neck of the peninsula, keeping his eye on them as they wended their way up the twisting path, waiting till Pearce and his party were well out of earshot. Then he called to his sergeant. "As soon as they can no longer see us, I want the shot moved and the cannon hauled over the powder store." "Did I not hear the officers say they was to be left, sir?" "They are being left, Sergeant. They are not being spiked or having their wheels smashed." The look that got was, to the Marine officer's mind, larded with potential insubordination, and his response was harsh. "We cannot expect a bluecoat to comprehend the loss of honour attendant on abandoning the guns to the enemy. I intend, when I rejoin my fellows, to be able to look them in the eye." "We'll not have the time to do that and break the camp of all of our equipment." "Equipment, Sergeant, can be replaced. Honour, once lost, is gone forever." Getting the wounded from the hospital into the boats, given their numbers, would have been a hellish task if it had not been for the sailors from HMS Hinslip. With that natural ability British tars had to overcome obstacles, they had ordered some spars brought ashore and jury-rigged a hoist, so that the more serious could be lowered to lay across the gunwales of the ship's boats. On Hinslip itself, another hoist was ready to haul them inboard, as steady as you like, so that excessive movement did not aggravate their wounds. Emily Barclay was only made aware that her husband had come out of his fever when his time came. She found him pale, obviously weak, and looking wasted, trying to sit up in bed, struggling with only one arm, an attempt he abandoned as she filled the doorway. Husband and wife looked at each other, neither wishing to be the first to speak. Only then did Emily notice that his eyes were red as if from weeping. Or perhaps it was a result of his fever. "There is a ship lying off the bay, a transport. We have to get you aboard." "Where is Brilliant?" Ralph Barclay demanded, struggling to sit up again. "I have no idea, husband," Emily replied, moving forward to restrain him. "There will be some orderlies here presently with a stretcher to carry you to the jetty." "I can walk," he insisted, trying to get out of bed and failing. "You cannot, husband. You've had a fever, a bad one, after your—" She could not finish it, so he did it for her, his face as pained as his stump must be.
"The loss of my arm?"
"Yes."
"Who took it off?"
"Surgeon Lutyens."
"Did he try to save it?"
There was bitterness in the way that was spat out, and Ralph Barclay's face bore an expression his wife had seen before, one which implied that the whole world was against him, implied that perhaps Lutyens had set to with knife and saw out of spite, not necessity. "You were carried in unconscious, Captain Barclay, and it was obvious to Heinrich."
"Is it Heinrich now?"
"It has been for some time," Emily snapped, her eyes flashing at the implication of over-familiarity. "I challenge you to stand over men in distress, as well as poor souls who are dying, and still hold to formalities."
"You were in a place you should not be. You should have been where you belonged."
"Captain Barclay," Emily said in a tired voice, "I no longer know where I belong." Two orderlies appearing at the door stymied any response, one carrying the canvas stretcher, the other a pair of trestles that at bed height would ease the transfer of the patient. Once more Ralph Barclay struggled to stand on his own, the effort being too much, and it caused him to fall back onto the end of his stump, bringing from his throat, even if the contact was cushioned by the bedding, a loud wail of pain. Emily heard it in the corridor, on her way to the next patient. Pearce was within sight of the hospital when he heard the dull explosion of Driffield's powder, wondering what had taken him so long. The fellow was, by his calculation, cutting it fine. He would have been even more discomfited had he seen the remains of the redoubt. The earthwork was intact, but the cannon, dragged from their positions, were shattered, especially the wheels, while the barrels lay hither and thither amongst the tattered tents and scattered cooking implements that had once been their encampment, the whole scene of destruction observed from a safe distance by Driffield and his men. They and their red coats were out of sight when the French, led by Colonel of Artillery Napoleon Bonaparte, crossed the top of the earthwork to see before them the scene. Aware that the accusing eyes of his inferior officer were upon him, Bonaparte said in an angry tone, "This Pearce has ensured that I will remember his name." It was a grubby Sir Sidney Smith who sat making his report to Admiral Lord Hood, black from head to foot, this caused by a combination of smoke, sheer scrabbling in the dirt, and the various substances, from tar to expended powder, to which he had been exposed. Aware that his mission had not been a complete success, he was trying to gauge how the older man was taking the news that many of the French capital ships were still intact, awaiting only rigging and sails, as well as crews, to be ready for sea.
"This will not go down well in London, Sir Sidney," said Parker, the other officer present.
"I am aware of that, sir, but my men did all that they were asked to do."
"Hardly that, sir," said Hood softly.
"In that, my lord, I mean all that was possible.
The Dons were tardy when they were not downright unhelpful." The accusation of treachery hung in the air, the notion that the Spaniards had not pursued the policy of destruction of the French warships with the necessary zeal. It took no great imagination to discern why. Spain, in every conflict since the Armada, had been England's enemy, often in alliance with Royal France. To have them in this present war as allies had always felt odd, though up till now Hood could not have faltered the desire of their sailors to defeat the ogres of the Revolution. If their soldiers had been less than wholly supportive, the senior Spanish naval officer had backed whatever plans Hood mooted to the hilt, deferring to him as the commander of the Allied force, because the British had the most powerful fleet. Yet a man would have had to be blind not to see that such a policy did not always sit well with the more junior officers. They still saw Albion as the traditional enemy, smarted daily about the occupation of Gibraltar, now 90 years a British thorn in the pride of Spain.
"I suspect they blew the 2 powder ships, my lord," said Smith. "They did not want us to have them any more than the French."
A couple of powder-filled frigates are neither here nor there, Sir Sidney, Parker responded. But those ships of the line they failed to burn will come back to haunt us.
They feared to make us too powerful, Hood snapped, causing both of his other officers to look at him. We are strange bedfellows, you know that, and so do they. The last thing they want is a British fleet in the Mediterranean so powerful that it would be unassailable by Spain alone.
Are you saying they will desert the alliance, my lord?
I am saying they have taken precautions to ensure they're not at a disadvantage if they do. Sir Sidney, I require from you a dispatch regarding your exploits of last night, to go with mine in due course back to London, where I dare say another nail will be manufactured from my words to seal my coffin.
Sam Hood had never looked young. He was, after all, in his 70s, but he had, up till now, looked sprightly. He did not appear to be that now. He looked worn down with the cares of his command.
We must find another anchorage, Parker. Since we still have French capital ships to contend with, it'll have to be one close enough to cover Toulon. Let's send out some more sloops and frigates to see what they can find.
Corsica, sir?
Yes, Sardinia to push.
If you recall the dispatch Lieutenant Pearce brought in during the summer, my lord, he has noted the main ports, such as Calvi and Bastia, are held by strong garrisons.
Then we might have to boot 'em out, Parker,
Hood retorted with some of his old fire.
You would do service in that, Sir Sidney, would you not?
Happily, sir, as would every officer in your fleet.
Right, Parker, Hood commanded. Once all is settled, signal the combined fleets to weigh for Leghorn.
The hospital was empty now, and Heinrich Lutyens walked the rooms to ensure that nothing had been left behind, at the same time wondering what fate had ensured he ended up here, doing that which he had sought to get away from in London, the exclusive practice of his profession. His sea chest was already aboard, but over his shoulder he had a satchel containing his notebooks and the ledger into which the hurried scribblings he had made these past 9 months had been copied. Were they complete? Could he, from what he had already, compile that treatise he had set out to compose, an academic study of the stresses and strains of naval life on the human mind? Idly he wondered if he would decline to serve on and go back to what he had left behind, a highly successful and lucrative practice based on the twin facts that not only was he highly thought of by his peers, but he was socially well connected through his father to the court of King George. Serving as a ship's surgeon was beneath his standing, a post normally occupied by men little above the old station of barbers. But it had not been without pleasures. The men he had studied on HMS Brilliant, including those pressed by Ralph Barclay, had provided him with much material, not least because he was educated John Pearce. And Lutyens had been in a proper battle, albeit below decks in the cockpit and out of sight of the action, had been taken prisoner when Ralph Barclay was forced to strike his colours, so he had that experience. Though it had been a benign confinement, given he had taken on the task of looking after the wounded from that sea fight. Wherever they were bound for now, he still had charges who required treatment, and he might be afforded further opportunities for study. After all, HMS Hinslip was a ship, another floating and confined world, where all the things that interested him would once more be on display. The interaction of humans with each other in a constrained wooden hull. Fears, bravery perhaps. The disputes that happened with men living cheek by jowl in damp conditions, and eating a diet so boring that their most common complaint was a compacted bowel. On top of that, there was the relationship between Emily Barclay and her husband. How would that work out? Plus, he still had, close and observable, John Pearce and his pelicans. Yes, there was still much of interest. Do you so enjoy being a prisoner that you fear to leave that estate? Heinrich Lutyens turned to face John Pearce, a haughty look on what had been described as a fish-like face, his fine nose in the air.
Given the lack of culture of the alternative, John, it has its attractions, "Come," Pearce said. "The last boat is ready to cast off."
They walked out and made for the jetty, past some very forlorn-looking locals, the fishermen, their wives and children, who eked out a living in this tiny bay. They would fear what was coming, even if they had, being poor and ignorant folk, done nothing to deserve to suffer from revolutionary retribution.
"Can we not, John—"
"No," Pearce said, cutting right across Lutyens, his face clouding into anger.
"I tried to persuade the captain to take them off with us, but he has strict orders from Hood. No civilians."
"Then may God bless them."
"As long as Dr. Guillotine does not."
Chapter 5. The sight of smoking Toulon had long disappeared over the stern as HMS Hinslip cleaved her way through a heavy swell, under lowering clouds that threatened worse weather to come, surrounded by the overladen ships of the combined fleets, somehow the attitude of gloom making itself felt over the intervening sea. On the quarterdeck stood Captain Sidey in his foul weather gear, oilskin coat and hat, legs spread to cope with the motion of the ship, his square, weather-beaten face, set and determined, eyes narrowed to keep out the flying spume. John Pearce stood on the leeward side, his arm hooked round a stay, well away from the water shipping in over the weather beam. Here the heavily canted deck took the bulwarks close to the grey, foam-flecked waters of the angry Mediterranean. He was wondering what the future held, there being something about staring at the shifting sea-water to invite introspection, for once they had landed at Leghorn, he would be looking for the first vessel home. He had, quite naturally, looked for HMS Brilliant, likely to be somewhere out here on the vast expanse of sea, but had gained no sight of the ship into which he had been originally pressed. It had been a long journey from Sheerness, full of incident, of initially seeking to avoid those with whom he had been taken up, only to become close to many of them, of being pressed not once but twice, of surviving being wrecked on a Breton shore, being raised more by malice than favour to the rank of midshipman, then, due to good fortune and the advice of better men, to success in battle and his present rank, that a gift from King George himself, that ignored the requirement that a naval lieutenant must not only have 6 years' sea time, but should face an examination by a panel of senior captains. None of it would have come about if he had not ducked into the Pelican to avoid a pursuit determined to put him in prison. One sojourn in the fleet as a youth, sent there with his father by a vengeful government seeking to shut up a radical voice, was enough to make anyone desperate to avoid repetition. Of course, not even that inadvertent slipping into the Thameside tavern would have occurred if he had not come back from Paris in the hope of getting lifted the warrant for sedition outstanding against both him and his father, far from well and still in the French capital. "A penny for your thoughts?" Pearce turned just in time to see Emily Barclay, in her hooded cloak, stagger, taken off guard by a suddenly much sharper tilt of the deck. Instinctively he held out a hand to stop her falling over, catching her wrist and pulling her towards him, only to find that she put out an equally determined hand, firm on his chest, to stop that resulting in more bodily contact.
"Always give one hand for the boat, Mrs. Barclay. I thought you would know that by now."
It took no effort to get her wrist out of his hand. Pearce was not seeking to keep hold of it, and she did that which she should have done before, stretched out to secure herself with a grip on the hammock netting. "Thank you, Lieutenant Pearce. I fear I spent enough time ashore to forget." Aware that he was staring at her, she looked quickly over the side. "It is all so grey. Not what they tell us about the wine-dark sea."
"There are spots of brightness, even in such a dull aspect as this."
"Do you know Homer?" she asked, avoiding what was clearly a compliment.
"I do, both the Iliad and the Odyssey.
And I have struggled to think what kind of wine the ancients drank that turned it the colour of sea-water, whatever the state of the sunlight. I cannot countenance blue wine any more than grey." "I think, sir, it was a poetic illusion." There are moments when poetry cannot do other than come to mind. For instance, the presence of a beautiful woman must have inspired Homer to write of Helen. Her voice took on a sharper note, and she looked into his smiling face. "Please, Lieutenant, can we put aside this gallantry?" "I shall, if you will stop calling me Lieutenant." "You are not, I hope, suggesting I use your given name?" "You do for Heinrich Lutjens." "With whom I have shared experiences that—" Emily Barclay stopped then, the words she was about to say too close to those she had used with her husband. "Perhaps, given that I have no duties, and yours will ease as the wounded recover, we might get to know each other better. I have an impression that such a thing would not displease you." "I must go below," she insisted, beginning to turn away, an act stopped by Pearce taking hold of her wrist again. "No. I have spoken too openly, and I promise I will not cause you any more embarrassment." "Why, Lieutenant?" Emily lied, seeking to look innocent. "I have no idea what you mean." Pearce grinned. She looked prettier than ever when she was dissimulating. "You asked what I was thinking about." "You were, you must admit, in a brown study." "I was thinking of the first time I saw you, and how I got to be there." Seeing he had upset her again, he spoke quickly. "And since you are wearing the same hooded cloak you were wearing that day, it had brought back to mind even more unpleasant memories." "My cloak?" "No, not that, but the circumstances in which it was observed. If you recall, your husband struck me a blow with his fist." Emily could remember that blow just as easily as John Pearce, and she could also recall that she was the cause of it, or rather the fact that he had stared at her as he was brought aboard the ship, and she had matched the look. "I am sorry he did that." "Do not apologize for him." "I didn't." Both had spoken too abruptly, and it rendered them silent. Yet both had in mind the same image, albeit from different perspectives. He, in seeing a strikingly beautiful woman where it was least expected, acting out of habit, not sense, to make sure he had marked her out. She, observing the line of bedraggled, pressed men, poor of appearance in the main. Then he appeared, so obviously different in look and bearing, albeit he was followed by a giant she now knew to be the Irishman O'Hagan. "In truth, you caught me when I was recalling what had brought me back from Paris." "Which was?" Emily asked, although she had a very good idea. Her husband, in the first days of Pearce's enforced service aboard HMS Brilliant, had intercepted a letter which he had sought to send to a famous radical politician in an attempt to gain his freedom. That, even coded and in French, had mentioned Paris and a sick parent, and she, better at the language than her husband, had been reluctantly persuaded to translate it. "My father's illness." "What were you doing in Paris?" "Avoiding prison." That brought her head round to look at him directly. "My father and I fled to Paris to avoid a writ for sedition issued in the name of King George, a King's Bench warrant against what he had written about the exploitation of the people by the monarchy and the government." "Your father was a leveller?" she asked, staring out to sea again. Pearce smiled, thinking that, given her probable upbringing, such a notion would be anathema. He would have been proud to have been called that. Folk named him the Edinburgh Ranter, and those who disliked his words and his works blackened him. But a kinder soul you have never met. Now she had to look once more at Pearce. The way his voice had softened with remembered affection made it inevitable. "And your mother?" "Died bearing me. I was brought up by my father, and in a way that has made me feel different to other men." "Hardly surprising, given what you say of his opinions." That being delivered with some pique, Pearce was tempted to rebuke her, to demand how she, no doubt the product of a comfortable upbringing with food always on the table, could possibly comprehend what life was like for the majority of her fellow Britons. But that would be to drive her away, so he stuck to reminiscing. "I did not mean that. My father was a man who saw the whole of his country as his home, and everyone in it as his brother. As soon as I was weaned, he took me on his travels, the length and breadth of the whole nation. I saw more in a month than most of my fellow countrymen will see in their lifetime, and not just places, but people from the lowest to the highest. Highest? In the company of a radical? Not every wealthy man sees disputing with a radical thinker as a crime. I've had many a happy time in great houses, and if we were invited to stay for long enough, I even went to school, though that was generally less pleasant. But enough of me. Tell me about you. There is nothing to tell that would match that which you seem to have enjoyed. Why did you marry your husband? He should not have said it, and he knew that, but he could not help himself. From the first time he had realized that Ralph Berkeley and she were wed, he had wondered at such an unlikely connection. A curiosity only reinforced as he had come to see his character and the way she opposed him. He was a callous man. She was a humane woman. "That, Lieutenant," she snapped, as one hand firmly on the netting she turned to leave, a signal gun sounding as if to mark the movement, "is none of your business." "All hands to wear ship!" Pearce knew that where he was standing he would be in the way as the sails were loosed and reset, but rather than follow Emily Berkeley towards the quarterdeck, he made his way forward, cursing himself, and ignoring the water that, blasting over the bowsprit, covered him and soaked his legs. Captain Sidey had notified all who came aboard that his birthday was imminent, and he clearly had a desire they should celebrate it. He had formed a choir aboard Hinslip, and given they were approaching the festive season, he was intent on their practising for the forthcoming nativity, as well as celebrating his name-day. If he made an error, it was inviting his passengers to join in, or at least one of them. The weather had moderated somewhat, the sky clearing as the wind swung away from the westerly towards the north, turning colder, so with the ship running steady, the seasonal songs were sung under what was slowly turning from bright blue into a starlit sky, loud enough to be heard by those ships sailing close enough in company. Sidey had a stentorian voice, and was a hearty chorister, and it was soon apparent, given the quality of the rendition, that he had schooled his men, for they sang without books, knowing the words. "Heathen songs to my ears, Charlie," Michael whispered, "but there's no doubt in the skill." Unlike Pearce, stood by the binnacle, book in hand, trying to sing along with the crew, the pelicans had avoided the warbling, thankfully in the eyes of most of those they were messing with, given they would have upset the harmony. Heinrich Lutyens was the problem. He seemed to be managing that without assistance. His high, reedy voice was rarely in proper tune, leading Emily Berkeley, standing by his side and singing sweetly, to occasionally and quite visibly wince. "I used to look forward to Yuletide," young Rufus said in an equally soft tone. "There was always a fair in Lichfield, and folk were generous to us youngsters." Then he shivered at being far from warm. "Not sure I'm doing that now, sat here." "It was a time of profit to me, lads, shamed as I am to admit it. This week in London it were full of visitors come for the season. Easy marks, most of 'em, and with bulging purses to boot." That got Charlie Taverner a look from Michael. "Holy Mary, Mother of God, Charlie, do you know what shame is, to be robbing folk at a holy time?" "You shamed yourself enough," Charlie hissed back. "Holy time or nay, but you were too drunk to ever recall it." "You were, Michael," Rufus said, more in sorrow. "Blind drunk." "Seems a long time since I was in that state." "Always ended with your wanting to fight some poor soul," Charlie complained, "with those damn great fists of yours." "Did I ever get round to you?" Never, mate. I was too nippy on me pins, and you was too drunk. So I tried." "You did? Now, would that be over your touching up Sweet Rosie?" "I never did." "Yes, you did, Charlie," Rufus insisted, which got him a hard look for his honesty. "Can't say I missed the pelican much," Michael said. "Her accepted."
"Belay that noise, you lot," one of the sailors muttered. "We's trying to sing."
It was Charlie who responded. He hated to be checked, even if the fellow doing it was in the right.
"You sound like a bunch of crows to me, mate." "From what I hear of you, mate, rooks is more your style."
Charlie made to move forward, an act arrested with ease by Michael O'Hagan.
Damn cheek.
"There ain't none of us saints, Charlie," Michael said.
"No, Michael, or we wouldn't have been stuck in the Liberties wondering where the next fill of ale was coming from."
As the singing soared, the trio fell silent, each still thinking of that. The Pelican had not been a place of much joy to the likes of Charlie and Rufus, or their mates, Abel Scrivens, now dead, and Ben Walker, captured by Barbary pirates and, as Pearce had discovered in Tunis, a slave of the Mussulmans. The quartet had eked out a precarious existence on the Thames riverbank. Not too bad in summertime, and damn near too deadly for the cold and starvation in winter, often reduced to hotbedding with others just to have a place to lay their head, and never sure where the next meal was coming from. They were bound to the place by their past, each one subject of some warrant for crimes committed, locked in the liberties of the Savoy where the writ of the tipstaffs did not run, free to roam only on the Sabbath. London and the teeming Strand was yards away at times, but they dare not step into that great thoroughfare or beyond for fear of being collared by the law on a weekday. Charlie least of all, he being a sharp who had worked nearby Covent Garden. Michael was one to come and go from the Pelican as he pleased. He was a free man. His reasons for being there more to do with the aforementioned Rosie than anything other. An apple-cheeked serving wench of ample proportions, she had been Michael's squeeze, due to his always having coin in his purse, and a manner of emptying it often, given that as a man who could seriously wield a shovel, there was always more to be earned in a city forever expanding. Charlie had hated him for his easy spending, but more for Rosie, on whom he had designs, thinking that he, being a handsome cove, and he was that, was more appealing than the Irishman's copper and silver. Rosie would have none of it. Michael O'Hagan paid for her favours, and if Charlie wanted to share them, to which she was not averse, then he must shell out for them likewise.
"I dreamt about us being pressed again last night,"
said Rufus, whose only crime was to have run from a bonded apprenticeship in the leather trade.
"Woke up a-trembling."
"It will be the Irish snores that will wake you, Rufus," Charlie whispered, "and they are loud enough to shiver the timbers."
Michael grinned at that. He was proud of his snoring, which was loud enough to drown out all the others doing likewise, each, with one watch on deck, in their 28 inches of hammock space.
"I don't recall that night, as you know," he said.
"You were so drunk you tried to belt Pearce when he told you to run,"
Charlie cackled. But that did not last, given it was not an occasion to remember fondly.
"We should have spotted them tars eyeing the place."
"And young Martin."
The boy they were speaking of, Martin Dent, a growing lad now and a skilful topman on HMS Brilliant, had been a drummer boy then, in a red coat that stood out a mile, even in that smoky, crowded place.
"We was too busy dunning Pearce for ale," said Rufus.
"I don't recall you getting him to shell out for drink," Charlie snapped, adding a finger gesture to one of the captain's choir.
"That were me, mate."
"You've got a silver tongue, Charlie, and no error."
"But nowt but air in his breeches," Michael scoffed.
"When I'm dreaming," Rufus insisted, "I sees them tars bursting in with clubs the size of spars, with us running always to no purpose."
Not only had Barclay's men rushed the tavern, they were outside the doors, front and back, waiting to catch hold of anyone trying to run. All three of them, Abel Scrivens and Ben Walker too, had, with John Pearce and more than a dozen others, found themselves bruised and battered, trussed like chickens, before being thrown into the boats and carried down the Thames to Sheerness. The singing of a hymn had reached a crescendo, the voices rising to a swelling sound that filled the gathering gloom, then stopping abruptly to leave Captain Sidey beaming with pleasure. That is, until he looked sideways to the surgeon. In a cut-down part of Sidey's cabin, Ralph Barclay swung in his cot, aware that he was well enough now to have joined in the choral observance of Sidey's birthday, and just as aware of why he had declined. Every attempt he had made in the last few days to catch hold of his wife and ask her what she meant by saying she had no idea of where she belonged had been thwarted by her insistence that she carry out her nursing duties. She was avoiding him, of course, but there was little he could do about it in such a crowded ship without making obvious to all and sundry the depth of their rift. The decks below were lined with cots full of the seriously wounded. Others were fit enough to use hammocks, like the crew. Where he was accommodated was not spacious, and in cutting off part of his own cabin for a post-captain, Sidey was an elderly lieutenant, he being a man without the interest or patronage necessary to see him elevated in rank. That, too, was much constrained. No one, it seemed, had seen anything untoward in Emily taking quarters elsewhere, in a screened-off cabin near that of Lutyens. They saw her as a nurse, not his wife, and besides, he was an invalid. When it came to nursing, the one man he had remaining from his ship, the ruffian Devereux, was a better attendant. It was he who had helped Ralph Barclay take the air the day after they weighed from Toulon, he who had caught hold of his collar when, reaching out a hand to steady himself against the roll of the ship, he had stuck out a stump and nearly fallen to his knees. How had he managed to forget his missing arm when the pain was a constant, occasionally relieved with a dose of laudanum? How would being a one-winged bird affect his career? That he did not know, though there were plenty of precedents of officers having suffered amputations going on to serve their full term. He knew he must see Admiral Hotham, the only senior patron he could rely on, for the one constant in the King's Navy, just as it was in normal life, was the need for the application of interest, the ability to call upon the intercession of a powerful patron to help secure advancement.
"How you faring, Your Honour?"
Devereux, a big man with a brutish face, had entered without knocking, and Ralph Barclay was about to damn him for insolence, only to check himself. He needed this fellow to care for him, so there was no sense in making him sullen.
"I am in pain. Perhaps Mr. Lutyens will spare me a little more tincture." "I'll see to it right off, Your Honour." "Did you take part in the singing, Devereux?" "Me, Your Honour, sing," the sailor replied, with a smile that showed the gaps in his teeth. "I only sing when I's full of grog, as you know. I'll see to that laudanum."
How did I end up being cared for by the likes of him? Ralph Barclay thought as the door closed, showing how little he understood Devereux, a man he had caused to be seized up for a flogging more than once. A fellow who hoarded his grog until he had enough to get insensibly drunk, and a bully to boot who stole the grog off his messmates or caused them to hand it over without protest at the implied threat of a beating, he inevitably sought to use his fists on those sent to restrain him. Yet he held no grudge against his captain. In a mind not much given to notions of fairness, he saw it as Ralph Barclay's right to regularly flog, in the same way as he saw it as his right to get habitually and stupidly inebriated. Needless to say, in the copious notes Heinrich Lutyens had made regarding the odd habits of the lower-deck ratings, Devereux and his ilk, for he was not alone, occupied several pages. Chapter 6. Ralph Barclay's desire not to attend Captain Sidey's feast was thwarted by the need to use the whole of the great cabin to accommodate his guests. The temporary bulkheads erected to form the convalescent cabin had to be struck down, so that all the leaves of the dining table could be put in place. Though not by any means a wealthy man, Sidey was determined on a good spread, raiding those stores he had acquired in Italy, for his duties prior to this one had taken him back and forth to Genoa. This allowed him to conjure up a substantial, if plain, meal, and, of course, from that source the cheeses were excellent, while the wine was plentiful and of a better quality than the usual blackstrap served on a daily basis. There was no question but that Emily Barclay had to sit next to her husband. He required assistance to cut his meat, the roast beef of Old England, as it was termed, even if it was part of an Italian cow. As accompaniment there was a brace of chickens from the coop on the deck, and part of an elderly sheep that provided mutton to feed them. The rest, in truth nearly the whole carcass, being given as a birthday treat for the ship's crew. At the table, sat as far away as possible from the one-armed man, was John Pearce, given his greatest desire was to put a knife into Ralph Barclay, not into the overcooked fowl on his pewter plate. He had challenged the man to a duel once. If the law did not incarcerate him for his perjury, he would do so again. That thought, surfacing as often as it did, was inclined to tempt him to glare, obliging him to take refuge in his goblet of wine. Lutyens was present, as was Lieutenant Driffield, who had scarce spoke a word to Pearce since coming aboard. Their sole conversation had been to confirm that the orders the marine had been given had been carried out, that followed by the impression that the fellow was avoiding him, Pearce reckoning he was still smarting about surrendering the cannon to the enemy. Also attending were 2 army officers, their wounds of the kind to allow them to be present, as was HMS Hinslip's Premier, Mr. Alt, a very new naval lieutenant who had a serious problem with his blush. No words of any kind could be addressed to him on any subject without his cheeks going a deep red, and that was also the case if Emily Barclay, the only lady present, caught his eye, not hard, given he was totally smitten, and looked at her from under his long, soft eyelashes with the mistaken impression that no one noticed. Sidey, using to the full his right as host to dominate the conversation, was regaling them with his previous service, naming captain after captain who had thought him an excellent subordinate.
As for fame, sirs, I served with Captain Arthur Phillips, and a finer seaman there never was, this being prior to his voyage to New South Wales, of course.
A hellish journey, according to the accounts of those who returned, said Lutyens. You do not see, Captain Sidey, anything to gainsay the sending of convicts to such a far-off location?
Got to send them somewhere, Mr. Lutyens. After we lost the Americas, it was that or hang 'em.
Which you are not in favour of?
Asked one of the army officers, the question slightly garbled by his wounded jaw.
Or so I sense by your tone.
Ain't me, sir, but the juries. They will not convict a felon if they fear he or she faces the rope, so the judges are reluctant to place on the black cap. And as for nippers—
Would you hang a child, Captain, asked Pearce, for the theft of a loaf of bread when they are starving?
Starving, sir?
Sidey demanded, forking a large gobbet of greasy mutton into his mouth.
They all claim they are starving, Mr. Pearce, but how is we to know when and where it is the truth?
Generally, a look at the ribs provides a good indication, Pearce replied, pointing to those on the beef, visible where it had been carved.
If it has the appearance of those on your table, then it is proof enough.
Having been in prison, John Pearce had seen the kind of undeserving folk that ended up there, just as he had seen the kind of dregs the human race could well do without, the sort that would steal your eyes given half a chance, then come back for the holes. He and his father had been obliged to take turns at sleeping in their original cell, a space so crowded with humanity there was scarce room to lie down, the straw on the floor full of vermin, as well as the filth that overflowed from the communal bucket. Thankfully, their stay had been brief. Adam Pearce's friends, fellow radicals, had got together the funds to procure them a private cell and food to eat, before raising a bond for their release. He had been brought up by a singular man, a peripatetic widower may be, but a caring parent, and, as he had told Emily Barclay, they were rarely still as Adam Pearce journeyed all over the country preaching his solutions to the evils of the existing system of governance, one in which the rich had too much and the poor too little. John Pearce had been taught to wonder how men and women of means could walk or carriage by people dying in the gutters without asking themselves if their Christianity obliged them to do something about it. That had been one of his father's favourite stump topics, the hypocrisy of religion. Adam Pearce earned his sobriquet of the Edinburgh Ranter on those occasions, as he castigated his audience, churchgoers all, for their indifference to the suffering of others, This while his son, carrying round the hat to collect the funds needed for food and board, kept a weather eye on those who would rob him if they could. Too often the offspring of the very people Adam Pearce was demanding his listeners' support. Life had improved in '89, when the French Revolution sent radical British hearts soaring. More, it turned out once the dust had settled and the Revolution revealed its true colours, from the fall of the Bourbons than any love of liberty. That bright dawn, as the poet Wordsworth had called it, brought prosperity to Adam Pearce and a degree of fame of the kind he had not previously enjoyed. His opinions had been sought by men of stature, his written pamphlets eagerly purchased and read by folk who thought they would welcome change, making life comfortable, if not outright wealthy. Then a frightened government had reacted a second time to his blasts against privilege, obliging both Adam and his son to flee to France.
End of CD 2. CD 3.
"I see you have a soft heart, Lieutenant," said Alt, his cheeks turning bright scarlet as he broke the train of Pearce's thoughts. "Let me say that I would prefer that the needy be taken to somewhere they might prosper than hung up on a gibbet." "From what Captain Phillips has written to me, they will not prosper in New South Wales, sir. By all accounts, the place is not fertile." "There are parts of it which are, Captain Sidey, for I too, or rather my father, had news of the colony. But they are all in the hands of those who supervise the convicts, and not of the convicts themselves." "Do tell them who your father is, Pearce," growled Barclay, with a face that matched his tone. Hitherto silent, Ralph Barclay was suffering from a combination of laudanum and good Italian wine, as well as his proximity to his wife. Thus, in his manner and his form of address, he breached the convention in a naval setting that officers were polite to each other at all times, regardless of personal feelings, for the very simple reason that on voyages that could last for 6 months or more, not to do so would lead to mayhem and very likely murder. Pearce's tone was equally cold. "You make it sound, sir, as if I should be ashamed of the connection." "I would, if it were me." "But you are not me, Captain Barclay." "Of course not," Emily Barclay cut in, a rather forced smile on her face. "I am sure you are as proud of your parentage as is my husband." "A toast," called Sidey, lifting his goblet high, "to our dear mothers and fathers." That was not an injunction anyone could gainsay, and it was a shrewd ploy by a man who plainly knew when an argument might brew up to ruin any chance of conviviality. Collectively, everyone murmured the words and drank deep. It was young Alt, too stupid or inexperienced to see what his superior had stopped, who asked the question. "So, Mr. Pearce, is your father someone famous?" "Infamous, more like," snapped Barclay. "Does your wound pain you much?" said Sidey quickly, seeking an abrupt change of subject while glaring at his premier. "I've often wondered at how one would feel after an amputation." "I have observed, Captain Sidey," said Emily, speaking before her husband could respond, "that not only does it give great pain, but the memory clouds the loss. You will observe, if your manners allow you the curiosity, that my husband constantly reaches for his knife as well as his fork, only to be cruelly reminded that he cannot simultaneously lift both." "I am sure, Mrs. Barclay, that with you to care for him, your husband has much to comfort him, and a striking compensation for his loss." Well-intentioned, it was precisely the wrong thing to say, which Captain Sidey realized as he saw the thunderous look which crossed Ralph Barclay's face. Yet his fears that an outburst of foul temper was imminent were groundless. There was no way this particular guest was going to air his marital difficulties in public. Indeed, had Sidey been present more often at Toulon, and mixed with his fellow captains, he would have known to say nothing. The fact that Emily Barclay had moved from her husband's cabin to the hospital had been a subject of gossip, just as those who had seen them together in public, for instance at a ball they both attended when it looked as if the Allies could hold the port, had observed that it was a less than amicable relationship. The problem for Sidey and his dinner was that Ralph Barclay had to take his rising anger out on someone, and that had to be John Pearce, the last person to respect his rank or his opinions. And to do so, he chose to assuage Mr. Alt's curiosity.
His father, young man, is a certain Adam Pearce, who some would name as a traitor to his king and country.
It was instructive to look at the faces around the table, to see who knew the name and who, like Driffield, were ignorant. Not that such an obvious lack of knowledge prevented him from then looking aggrieved. If a post-captain implied something was deplorable, a lowly marine lieutenant would see it as advantageous to take his part. "Was Captain Barclay," Pearce said in a calm voice. "My father is dead, and as for his loyalty, it was to his fellow humans, and in that he never wavered." The whole table fell silent, no one looking in Pearce's direction except Ralph Barclay. It was hard to know who was blushing most, the young Premier or his wife, now looking at her hands. But eventually it was Lutyens who spoke. "My father is the pastor of the Lutheran Church in London." "And very well connected, I believe," exclaimed Emily quickly.
"Oh, yes. Queen Caroline often comes there to worship, and brings both the king and the princes to do likewise. She does like her masses said and sung in German."
"You have been to court yourself, Mr. Lutyens?" asked the jaw-damaged army officer.
"I have."
"Then, sir, you must describe it to us, for it is not a privilege given to many."
That intervention had everyone sitting forward and saved the dinner, as the conversation moved around Lutyens's descriptions of Windsor and Buckingham House as he fielded questions about protocol, the questionable behaviour of the various princes, King George's health after his bout of madness many years previously. Would the Prince of Wales gain the regency he so badly desired, bringing his Whig friends into power and deposing William Pitt? The only two people who did not take part were John Pearce and Ralph Barclay. Below decks, things had started out jolly enough. Captain Sidey had issued an extra tot of rum to each man, and the fresh mutton was a welcome change to the unrelieved diet of salted pork and beef, leavened with slush and peas. But it soon emerged there were tensions, not amongst the crew, but between the Pelicans and Sam Devereux, this emerging as the bruiser, with his scarred face and beetle brow, began to show signs of being drunk. From laughter and good cheer, the atmosphere slowly turned guarded. As usual, he'd been hoarding his grog, and, unbeknown to the rest of the crew, for those affected did not want to admit it, he'd been up to his old tricks in the article of persuasion, which amounted to a close-up sight of his great fist and a request that the victim should forego his ration and hand it over, something he had once tried on John Pearce. As the rum began to take hold, Devereux's eye fixed on Michael O'Hagan, a man he had fought and lost to in a bare-knuckle bout. Typically, he had since then seen some hidden advantage the Irishman had enjoyed. In short, his defeat had been a fluke.
"You can never trust a Paddy, shipmates, for he allus do something underhand."
Though not quite shouted, Devereux made his claim in a carrying voice, taking no notice of the fact that there were several Irishmen in the Hinslip's crew. The men who sat at his mess table adopted various ploys to avoid complicity in the statement, either looking hard at the table or, if they were really fearful, fixing the speaker with a blank and non-committal look they hoped would pass for agreement.
"It's in their blood, see, and if they are papists, it is worse, for they're stupid too."
"Sure it's a pity," Michael said, "that jaw of his ever got mending." The mess tables at which they sat on the gloomy main deck were not so far apart, the result being, even over a quiet babble of conversation, that remark was overheard.
"They say there's luck, mind," Devereux responded, "but I reckon they cheat."
Michael was about to respond, hands on the table ready to raise himself, when another voice spoke, one of the ship's crew, an older fellow, and no Paddy.
We have a way with trouble aboard this barkie, don't we, mates? And I ain't never met the man who will keep his feet on the deck one dark night when half the crew were intent on chucking him into the briny."
That was a warning even Devereux was not daft enough to ignore. He was being told to hold his tongue or face being chucked overboard, the fate of many a bully that had gone too far aboard ship.
"And I would say, when it comes to grog, a man should be satisfied with his ration."
The deck was crowded, but there was no doubt who was isolated.
"Well said, that man,"
called Michael. That was not the only dispute that took place on HMS Hinslip that day. Once the dinner was complete and the cabins put back in place, Ralph Barclay had a chance to berate his wife.
"You took his part, madam, against me, your own husband. How am I to hold up my head in such a circumstance?"
The voice was slurred due to that combination of liquid opium and wine, and his jaw seemed uncommonly slack as he fixed his wife with a look best described as hangdog. "I did not, husband. I merely tried to prevent you from making a fool of yourself."
"A fool, damn you!"
"Moderate your language, sir," Emily hissed, "as well as the sound of your voice. There is but a thin wooden bulkhead between us and Captain Sidey's cabin."
"Moderate, you say? Am I to be that when you do nothing but traduce me?"
"You are allowing your imagination to run as fast as your tongue." It was with bleary eyes that Ralph Barclay gazed at his young wife, once so obedient, once so in awe of him that she would scarce raise her voice, wondering where it had all gone wrong. "You need rest, Captain Barclay," Emily insisted. "You have overtired yourself."
"Damn it! If I only had 2 arms, I'd make that swine pay for the way he insulted me."
"Of course you would," Emily replied, easing off with great gentility his heavy uniform coat before helping him to get into his cot so that he did not trouble his wound. This was no time to remind him that John Pearce had challenged him once already to a duel, and he had used the excuse of his superior rank and of forbidding royal ordnance to avoid it.
"You must stand by my side, Mrs. Barclay," he said softly but vehemently. "It is nothing but your duty. Love, honour, and obey, madam. That is the vow you took."
"Rest now." Ralph Barclay closed his eyes. He was indeed weary, and with his wife watching he quickly fell into a slumber, his face relaxing as he did so, making him look less the stern naval captain and more like a benign uncle. Gazing at him, Emily wondered at what would become of them, for she knew that the way she had behaved in Toulon was challenging in the extreme to the social order of which she was a part. The wound might take him home, her also, and she knew that to do the same in England would damn her in the eyes of everyone in polite society, and that probably would include her own parents. Her now sleeping husband was right about those marriage vows she had taken. They were held to be sacrosanct, and to be obeyed.
"Mr. Pearce, I am sorry to call you onto the deck to have this conversation, but I wish it to be a discreet one."
It was already dark, so Captain Sidey's square and ruddy face, in the light from the binnacle, had an ethereal quality. John Pearce had a very good idea of what was coming, and he was not sure how to react.
"As you know, Captain Barclay holds post rank," Sidey said. "He is, in short, my superior officer."
"And mine," Pearce responded, just to add to his thinking time.
"Of course. As my superior, I am in no position to check him."
"I would not say that, Captain Sidey. If a man displays a lack of manners at the dinner table, I think any other guest is well within their rights to haul him up with a round turn. Rank bestows many privileges. The freedom to insult is not one of them." Even in the faint, glowing light, Pearce could see the look of disbelief on the captain's face. He was employed in a service when rank gave his superiors the right to be as rude as they liked, one they frequently exercised. "Perhaps it would help, sir, if I afforded you a little history." The affirmative reply lacked conviction. Sidey did not want to be drawn into what smacked of complicity, yet having broached the matter, he could hardly refuse this man an explanation. He listened, chin on chest, as Pearce told him the background to his dispute with Ralph Barclay, but not about the case he intended to bring against him. He did not trust him not to speak of it. "So you see, Captain Sidey, my position, the method of my recruitment, plus my lack of a desire to advance myself in this profession, gives me the grounds to speak as I find, one I have exercised on men of higher station than our wounded post-captain."
"Well, surely you must make allowance for his wound."
"You, sir, do not know him, and so ascribe his manners to his affliction. I can assure you I do know him, and the loss of his arm and the consequent pain have nothing to do with his behaviour. That is how he is."
"Then think of my position, sir," Sidey insisted, moving his head further into the light to make his point. His voice had in it a hint of desperation. Elderly he might be, but there was still a flicker of ambition in the man, the hope common to all naval officers that by some stroke of good fortune, or chance meeting with someone of influence, he might make that great leap from his present rank to the post-captain's list.
"The best way to avoid compromising that, sir, is never to have us both at the same board again."
Sidey was relieved, he could see that. Pearce was giving him a way out, but there was a sting in the tail. "Mind you, sir, I would be most put out if I discovered that I was the only one whose attention this problem was drawn to. I fully expect you to ask Captain Barclay to mind his conduct. After all, we are bound to meet in places other than your cabin, on this deck, for instance."
"I had intended to speak with him, of course,"
Sidey said. "Good," Pearce snapped, for he did not believe him. "I dare say, when we are both taking the air on deck, the fact that you have done so will be plain for all to see."
"We will be in Leghorn soon,"
Sidey said, with an air that told Pearce he would be glad to see the back of both of them. Chapter 7. The Tuscan port of Livorno had been a base for English sailors for half a century. Why it had been translated into being called Leghorn by those same mariners was lost in the mists of time. John Pearce asked, but received no answer that satisfied his curiosity. Built on marshy ground, the ancient port was a mass of canals, to rival Venice, running around the fortified walls of the city, the harbour itself dominated by an old redstone fortress falling into disrepair, with the main defensive bastion long since moved inland, making it less vulnerable to cannon fire from sea-borne attackers. Lord Hood had chosen it as the place to land his refugees simply because it was an Austrian fief. The Grand Duke of Tuscany was the brother of the present Holy Roman Emperor. It was one of the three main trading ports of Italy, along with Genoa and Naples, and had for decades, in times of war, been used as a base for British privateers. Ships and crews granted letters of marque from the Crown to prey on the trading vessels of the enemy. Naturally, at this time there was a strong, if less than upright, colony of fellow countrymen waiting to greet the British elements of the arriving armada, not with much joy, since when it came to taking prizes, the two elements of British sea power, being in direct competition, loathed each other. The privateers' captains also knew the risks they ran by having so many king's ships and men close by, even if their crews had protections that saved them from being pressed. Those that did not see it as prudent to get quickly to sea would stay out of harm's way in their own part of the port. There was nothing elegant about the way the combined fleets entered the anchorage. The wind was foul, and the swell heavy enough to make even anchoring the larger vessels a trial, and it was certainly too strong to allow the capital ships, stuffed with so many souls that scarce an inch of planking was free from bodies, to warp themselves into the quays. Added to that, there was an element of continued alarm. Unbeknown to those aboard HMS Hinslip, which, bearing wounded, was allowed to tie up to the harbour wall, albeit with a line of marines under the command of Lieutenant Driffield to ensure no desertions, a rumour had circulated that the port was already short of food,
so non-military personnel would be refused permission to land. That turned out to be false, leaving as a mystery how such a story had been concocted, and, even more puzzling, the notion of how it had swept through a fleet at sea. The scenes on the quays, as boats plied back and forth with dishevelled refugees, were reminiscent of Toulon, if in reverse, as the exiles taken off by the Allied fleet were landed. Many came from British warships, given that once the soldiers and sailors Hood commanded had been taken aboard, he had opened his vessels to those fleeing the revolution. Some kissed the stones of the harbour upon landing, never having felt safe afloat, only gaining any sense of security on land. Other frantic souls rushed around asking questions of the newly disembarked, or searching every arriving boat for the face of a loved one, a husband, wife, or child. Those who had lost relatives had also lost most of their possessions, and were thrown upon the mercy of the young Grand Duke. Fortunately for them, he was, like his father before him, an enlightened ruler and a good Christian. Food was made available, and his officials were on hand to seek suitable accommodation for those in distress. Added to that, Livorno had a good modern hospital, so that the more seriously wounded could be brought ashore to beds, better for recovery, given they would not be subject to the vagaries of vessels riding at anchor on a disturbed winter sea.
Lieutenant Pearce, is it not?
Supervising the loading of the less seriously wounded men onto a sprung cart, which was acting as an ambulance, the more serious cases had gone by boat using the extensive Livorno canals, John Pearce turned at the sound of the high-pitched voice to find himself looking down at the smiling face and diminutive frame of Captain Horatio Nelson. Being very aware of the major difference in height, he took a step backwards before replying, touching his hat to a man he respected. "Good to see you, sir."
"Not, I think, in these circumstances, Mr. Pearce," Nelson replied with a pained expression as he looked around him. "We are surrounded by tragedy."
"They are alive, sir, and there is no certainty they would still be so if they had stayed in Toulon."
"Do you think so, Mr. Pearce? It is hard to believe the French Jacobins are as barbaric as they say."
"They are just that, Captain Nelson, believe me." Nelson nodded. He had been gifted a brief outline of the past of the man with whom he was conversing, and knew that when it came to knowledge in that quarter he could not gainsay a fellow who had actually witnessed their behaviour at first hand.
"I have just encountered the Comte de Grasse, poor fellow. He got his frigate out of Toulon, but at the price of not knowing what has become of his wife and small children. To think that the grandson of one of France's greatest admirals could be so distressed."
Looking along the teeming quay once more, Nelson asked,
"Was it as bad as they say, Toulon?"
"I should think worse. What we saw from our boats was terrifying, so ashore it must have been like hell to be amongst it. I have heard only garbled accounts." Pearce left the Hinslip's crew and Driffield's marines to carry on with the loading, while he informed Nelson of some of the things he had witnessed, noticing the pain his tale caused in a man who gave the impression of being too sensitive a soul for the occupation he followed. But then he recalled this pint-sized captain had a reputation for being an ardent fighter, always to the fore if a fight was expected. Hard to believe, since looking at him, Pearce was left to wonder if he had the strength to lift a cutlass.
"The last time I saw you, Pearce, you were bound for Naples."
"I was, sir.
And I asked you to convey my compliments to the ambassador, and my letters, of course."
Pearce kept his face expressionless then. He had garnered at their last meeting, anchored off Tunis, the distinct impression that Nelson was more interested in the beautiful Lady Hamilton than her husband.
"They were delivered, sir, as you requested."
"And Lady Hamilton? You found her well?"
"I had no opportunity to talk with her, sir. Sir William came out to meet us with a most urgent message for Lord Hood." Seeing the crestfallen look, Pearce changed the subject.
"Your mission in Tunis, sir?"
"A farce!"
Nelson barked, for the first time showing a trace of that fiery reputation.
"I am of the opinion that Britannia should negotiate, of course, but I am also of the view—"
"That a little gunnery concentrates the mind," Pearce said, smiling as he interrupted him. That humoured look did not anger Nelson. If anything, it pleased him.
"You read my thinking most accurately, Mr. Pearce."
Then, looking past him to the Hinslip's gangplank, he added,
"This was not the ship in which you last sailed. You are no longer serving on HMS Farron."
"No, sir. In fact, I am in truth no longer serving anywhere."
"We's ready to be off, Your Honour,"
said Charlie Taverner to Pearce's back, cutting off any response from the captain, and careful, as were Rufus and Michael, to always address him properly when another officer was present. It was only if you looked into the eyes you could discern the twinkle that hinted at something less than outright respect. Looking past him at the loaded cart, Pearce asked,
"What of Captain Barclay?"
"He wishes to travel alone, Your Honour,"
Charlie replied,
"or with his wife, not wishing to share the transport with ordinary soldiers."
"Or any transport under my command," thought Pearce.
"Barclay?"
asked Nelson.
"He is a casualty."
"Lost an arm, sir. Left one, just above the elbow."
"Poor fellow. Is he still aboard?"
The word obviously formed, but sarcasm was inappropriate, so it was the word yes that was said.
"Then I must visit with him."
"His mood is somewhat, how shall I put it, truculent, sir."
If Nelson wondered at the way Pearce said that, or the grin it produced on Charlie Taverner's face, he was not about to inquire. If he had, he might have been told that in refusing to give his true name on being pressed into HMS Brilliant, truculence was the name under which John Pearce had been entered in the ship's muster book, and it had been, since that day, a private joke between the Pelicans.
"Are you advising I should not call upon him? That his wound is too serious?"
"No, sir.
I am saying, however, that his mood is likely to be standoffish." "I can live with that, Mr. Pearce. A man has that right if he has suffered such an affliction."
With that, Nelson, executing quick strides, was off up the gangplank. Pearce was watching him, shaking his head at the notion that anyone would call upon a man like Barclay, when Michael, having crept up behind him, whispered in his ear,
"John boy, if you look along the quay you will see that devil Gerson."
"Has he spotted us?"
"Sure. He's staring hard enough."
Pearce turned slowly and nonchalantly, seeking out Gerson's face in what was a crowded vista. But the man was easy to spot, as much by his faux discreet manner as anything else. Then there was his absurdly handsome face, under that near-white hair, and the very obvious glare of dislike. They had been boating down to Sheerness that night they were pressed, when they first met the lying, toadying swine, if met was the right word for a body in nothing but a long flapping shirt coming off London Bridge, tossed over by human hands, Charlie reckoned. He landed right by the cutter as it was negotiating the strong currents created by the bridge pillars, to be hauled in by his collar, saving his life, if not pleasing him by the outcome.
"He's dressed in gentleman's garb, Michael. Those clothes he is wearing are of fine quality."
"Would be, John boy, given Barclay took him on as his clerk."
"Then he best watch his funds, for if Gerson is close to his strong box, they won't be his for long."
"Why's he hovering round here?"
asked Charlie, speaking out of the corner of his mouth.
"Maybe he still has business with Barclay."
"Then it'll be bad business with that shite,"
Michael spat.
"Whatever business it is, lads, it is none of ours. Our task is to get our wounded to the hospital."
As soon as he showed a sign of moving, Driffield appeared and signalled to some of his marines to accompany the cart. With so many privateers' vessels in the port, the temptation to run was a strong one for tars, known to be a body of men given to going absent without any excuse. Ralph Barclay did not have to be in a bad mood to be short with Horatio Nelson, given he despised the man. Standing before him, looking sympathetic, was a fellow post-captain whom he saw as damn near an enemy, and certainly a rival. Where he had been obliged to press men to man his ship, Nelson, who arse-licked Hood, to Barclay's way of thinking, had been gifted a full complement of hands from the volunteers gathered at the Tower of London. Worse than that, the pint-sized poltroon, barely ahead of him on the captain's list, had been given command of HMS Agamemnon, a line of battleship of 64 guns, while he had been given the smallest frigate commensurate with his post rank. Resentment came easily to Ralph Barclay. He begrudged the fact that Nelson was held in high regard by Lord Hood, while he was not, resented that his previous patron, Admiral Sir George Rodney, had died and left him without a senior naval sponsor at a critical time, albeit he was now well in, he thought, with Admiral Hotham. He and Brilliant had been tied up to the quay at Toulon like a damned guard ship, while Nelson went a-whoring all over the western Mediterranean on special missions, and no doubt got a chance to line his pockets by gathering in a few valuable prizes. "You must tell me how you got your wound, Captain Barclay." The reply was very nearly a snapped, "Fighting the enemy while you were swanning around as Hood's bum boy." But his wife was present, and given he was between doses of laudanum and thus in pain, he took part of his ire out on her, once he had given Nelson the bare bones of the event. A force had been assembled to attack one of the French batteries that was causing too much trouble, given it had an especially large cannon that could land its balls in the harbour. He was looking past Nelson to Emily when he spoke on, outlining with one hand where the nuisance lay, and also the position of the redoubt in front of the one he commanded, which he had been exchanging fire with for weeks. "The assault took my opponents in flank, drove them from their position, and the troops moved on to the major target. My wife's nephew, Midshipman Burns, had brought up from HMS Britannia a party of tars to spike the abandoned French cannon once captured. But when it came time to do his duty, he failed to carry out his orders." Seeing that his wife was stung, for he had not told her of this, he added, "And not, I'm sad to say, for the first time. The boy is shy." "Shy?" Nelson asked, as if the notion that a midshipman might not do his duty was unbelievable. "He is too young to carry such responsibility," Emily protested, though she did wonder why she was defending a relative she now sought to avoid. Toby was her nephew, but what her husband was saying was no less than the truth. Then she realized what he was about, paying her back for the slights she had laid upon him by attacking her blood relative. That she would not let pass, and it was with a biting tone she continued, "He was forward enough, husband, when it came to doing your bidding." That gave Ralph Barclay pause. He had coached Toby Burns to lie at his court-martial, to take upon himself the blame for the fact that the crew from HMS Brilliant had pressed men who were not seamen by profession, as they should be, but had been in a part of London on the River Thames, the liberties of the Savoy, where to press anyone was forbidden by ancient statute. "He supported you, husband, when you demanded it of him. Perhaps if you trained him more assiduously for the duty you say he failed to carry out, he might have done better." The look of confusion on Nelson's face was obvious. He was in the middle of a family spat with no way to politely leave without making the knowledge obvious. It was Barclay who saved him, by continuing his tale, suddenly more willing to talk of that than whatever was the cause of the dispute with his wife. He also put his good hand to his stump, and let a look of pain suffuse his face. "I am tiring you, sir." "No, Captain Nelson. Allow me to finish my tale." Knowing Emily was glaring at him, he was in no position to further damn her nephew. "I went forward to do the spiking with the lad, who may have got lost on the way." "More likely, you must admit, Captain Barclay," Nelson proposed with some feeling, turning to look at his fellow captain's wife with some appreciation. "I am sure that any sprig of your tree, Mrs. Barclay, would be a stout one indeed." Emily had to just nod at such idiocy, much as she wanted to do otherwise, given she was not fond of this little fellow either, seeing him as given to tittle-tattle of the kind that had got her into trouble in Sheerness. She had gone to an assembly dance the night her husband was out hunting for men, and had taken pleasure, as she had all her life, in the dancing. This Captain Nelson had told her husband how much she had enjoyed it, and, given he was not one to take pleasure in such pursuits himself, and given to jealousy, had caused her no end of trouble. Ralph Barclay was annoyed at being interrupted, and spoke tersely. "Do you wish, sir, to hear this tale?" Forgive me, Nelson responded, turning back, while cursing himself for so openly admiring the man's wife, a fault to which he knew he was prone, and not just here in this cabin.
Well, we did as was required. Then General O'Hara, who planned the assault, came up and, stupidly to my mind, went too far forward. Anyway, he was wounded.
I heard he was taken prisoner. That got Nelson another hard look. He had ordered Devereux, who was with him, to take the wounded general back to safety. The man had ignored him and saved his comatose captain instead, leaving O'Hara to be taken by the enemy.
He was, but I took a musket ball from the French counterattack just as I exited the redoubt, which, we having set the charges, was blown to perdition. I was saved from capture myself by one of my own ratings.
Who is to be commended, sir?
Of course,
Berkeley replied, totally unaware he had signally failed to do anything of the sort.
Suddenly he wanted shot of Nelson, so he said, "You must forgive me, Captain. I am somewhat fatigued."
Of course, Captain Berkeley, Nelson replied. It only remains for me to wish you a speedy recovery and a return to service soon. The stump moved.
This may hinder any employment, sir.
Nonsense, Captain Berkeley. I am sure you will soon be in command of a ship once more. Mrs. Berkeley, I bid you good day.
You could not wait to shame me, could you?
Ralph Berkeley said as the sound of Nelson's heels faded. In that, sir, Emily snapped, going out of the door, I cannot begin to compete with you. She ran straight into Cornelius Gerson with a sheaf of papers under his arm, who gave her the kind of smile with which she had become familiar, one that told her she was an object of his unwanted attention, and not just that, desire. What do you want? Ah, Mrs. Berkeley, we could perhaps stand for some time to outline that, but I fear I would keep your husband waiting. I certainly have no yearning to delay you. The calculating look on the face was infuriating, and she would have been even more upset if she had known the train of his thoughts. Cornelius Gerson saw himself, and in truth with some evidence, as an accomplished seducer. Was it not that very ability which had got him chucked off London Bridge by the thugs hired by an irate and cuckolded husband, who just so happened to also be his employer? To him, the likes of Emily Berkeley presented a challenge, one he felt certain he had both the charm and the looks to overcome, and, once he had achieved that, to make her his willing slave. That she had rebuffed him so absolutely turned attraction into deep dislike, while his spiteful nature looked for revenge. Emily Berkeley loathed him, and had done from the very first time he had sought to use her husband's empty cabin to carry out his clerkish tasks. Annoyingly, he did not move to let her pass, but forced her to squeeze past him, feeling her body through both their garments, and emitting a soft sigh that made her want to turn and slap his face.
"Gerson!"
she heard her husband bark as the man went into him.
"You took your damn time in coming?"
I had some difficulty, sir, in getting away.
Is Gleister still in temporary command of my ship?
Yes, sir, Gerson replied, pulling an unhappy face. And awaiting a new captain.
And our little enterprise?
If Ralph Berkeley had been glum before Gerson entered his temporary quarters, he was a sight more so once he heard what had happened in Toulon harbour. The scheme he and Gerson, anticipating a forthcoming evacuation, had concocted, to sell supplies stolen from the French warehouses, had come to naught. His premier, Gleister, who had been brought into the scheme, seemingly fearful of being found out, had thought it best to rid the ship of a dangerous cargo worth several hundreds of pounds.
Tossed in the harbour, you say?
They were, sir, down to the last tub of nails and length of cable. Chapter 8. The very idea of going aboard HMS Victory was not one John Pearce had ever liked. On the main deck, having given in his name, he joined what seemed like a whole crowd of folk seeking an interview with Lord Hood. There were British and French officers of several different ranks and services, Men who looked to be local traders who would be seeking contracts to supply the fleet, as well as civilians recently forced to become émigrés in the Toulon evacuation, who no doubt wanted to know how they were going to get from this Italian port to some other part of Europe more congenial. In his previous dealings with Hood, John Pearce had often bypassed the endemic queues his office attracted, but on those occasions the Admiral had urgent need of his services. Now he did not. The task he was being asked to perform was not pressing, so he knew he was in for a long haul. Yet hang around he must, and it had nothing to do with Hood's private correspondence. He needed passage home for his friends, and the only man who could give the Pelicans permission to sail on some returning naval vessel, in company with him, was the Commander-in-Chief. He sought to remain unobserved, not easy on an open deck. He had been found waiting once before, and that always led to an invitation to the Victory's wardroom. Though the occupants were kind, they were avid warriors who would oblige him to tell his tales of action, even if he had done so before. Repetition of exploits never troubled the naval mind. They were the staple of conversation. Added to that, they would be bound to inquire as to the purpose of his calling, and he was in no mood to explain to a group of committed naval officers, who thought him a heroic fellow for the actions in which he had taken part, albeit leavened with a touch of jealousy for the luck he had enjoyed, why he was seeking to get out of a service they held in high regard, and a theatre of operations presenting such glittering opportunity. The day dragged on. New bodies joined the queue, and one of Hood's lower clerks, a scrub-wigged tub of lard, sat at a desk before the great cabin doors, called out the relevant names. Someone entered to remain there for as long as it took to transact their business, and as they exited, the next name was called, obviously from some kind of list, with Pearce having no idea of the relative importance of the interviewees or where he stood in relation to them. Occasionally the pipes would sing out at the entry port, the Marines would gather, and someone of a superior sort would arrive, to be ushered through the throng and, as soon as the cabin was vacated, sent straight in to meet with the Admiral. For the fourth time in as many hours, Pearce approached the desk to seek some information on how long he would have to wait, finding himself standing before a fellow who could barely contain a sneer when he replied to such a request from a mere lieutenant. Of the sort John Pearce had met many times in his life, and more often than not in the company of his late father, the man did not know how close he came to having his ears boxed, being saved by the two Marines standing guard outside the great cabin. It was their presence, and the fact he would probably have to fight them too, which saved the neck of this unctuous little toad.
His lordship has a list of who is seeking an interview, and he decides who he shall see and in what order.
I do not ask to jump the list, merely to know whereabouts I am upon it.
That I cannot tell you.
Cannot or will not? Pearce demanded. Getting no reply and thinking a trick might work, he asked for use of the clerk's pen and paper. Judging by the look that received, it was as if he had asked for permission to sleep with his mother.
I am not at liberty.
Pearce leant over the desk, speaking quietly but with passion.
If you do not do that, or find out from within that cabin how long I will have to wait, I will inform everyone on this deck of something the Admiral would not want them to hear, and for that he will blame you. Such as?
The clerk scoffed. Pearce pulled Hood's letter from his pocket and shoved it under the fellow's nose.
Do you recognize that seal, even broken?
A nod.
Then if you do not wish me to make public the contents of what is a private and embarrassing communication, go through that door and tell Lord Hood I will not wait another bell. And I assure you, if you do not do as I have asked, the price to me will be nil, while the price to you will probably be the loss of your position.
The eye contact was an attempt by the clerk to discern if this lieutenant was bluffing. Perhaps it was the steadiness of the gaze, or the sheer fury that suffused the face, that persuaded him to rise slowly and enter the great cabin. He was gone for half a minute, and when he returned he tried, by adopting a superior tone, to retrieve his position.
"I have told Lord Hood you are waiting, Lieutenant, and he has said he will see you shortly."
Given Lord Hood was seeking his services, any hope that his welcome might be couched in polite terms was immediately dashed. They had never been good in each other's company, and there was some grudging respect for an older man who declined to play the hypocrite.
"God, it's a bad penny, Parker. I prayed the last time we'd met I'd seen the back of you, Pearce."
"While I would have been content never to lay eyes upon you at any angle, my lord, and since I have spent several hours standing outside your cabin, and I am here at your express request, I rather think something to eat and drink might be in order instead of insults for a greeting."
"We're not a coffee-house, damn you!"
"I think you have forgotten, my lord, that you have requested something of me."
"I have not forgotten, Pearce, but given the favours I've done you, I think I deserve some repayment in kind, like a modicum of courtesy."
"Favours? All I can ever recall is your putting me in mortal danger." John Pearce could see Admiral Parker looking at the deck beams above his head, this while he tried to recall a time when he and Hood had ever exchanged a pleasantry. As for those previous favours, they had reeked more of blackmail than anything else, and had, in truth, seen him nearly killed in the execution of one of them. Hood was accustomed to deference. The snag with the man before him was his congenital inability to defer to anyone, however elevated their rank.
"Mortal danger is not uncommon for naval officers."
"You want me to deliver some letters?"
"Of course I do," Hood barked. "I would not have wrote you had I not."
"Then you must provide me not only with them, but with the means to get myself and my companions back to England."
"I must,"
the older man demanded, that before he realized Pearce was speaking nothing but the truth. His tone did not modify much, but it did, a little, become affirmative in place of angered.
"I must."
Parker intervened.
"You can take passage on the next ship returning home."
"And when will that be?"
"It will be when I say it'll be,"
Hood insisted. Parker stopped another objection from their visitor, acting as he always seemed to do as Lord Hood's more emollient half.
"When his lordship decides on the next course of action, we will be sending dispatches back to England. There are several ships in the fleet in need of repair, and since without Toulon we lack a dockyard, they will have to take turns to return home to be refitted."
"We held Toulon for several months."
"We held it under siege. You do not put vessels into dock if you might have to abandon them there." "Sit down, Pearce,"
Hood growled, which had John Pearce looking at him defiantly.
"Damn it, man, can you not even respond to a civility?"
"I don't recall receiving one." The next words were softer, if not more respectful.
"Sit down, damn you. And Parker, ring for Miss Stewart and get this rascal some provender."
"My lord, we have a list of people waiting to see you." Hood sounded weary as he responded to that.
"Are you going to argue with me as well?"
"No, my lord." Sat at the table opposite Hood, and thus closer to him than hitherto, the lines in the older man's face were etched more deeply than Pearce had realized. It was with some insight, and one he had not previously truly considered, that he realized the weight this septuagenarian carried. He was far from London, and required to make instant decisions that might or might not be approved by his masters back home, the burden carried by every commanding officer on foreign service. It was almost as if Hood read that thought, for he referred to the very thing when he spoke, and when he did, it was in a weary voice that reflected his age.
"I doubt you can even begin to comprehend, Pearce, what I have to deal with."
"You forget I have seen the number of supplicants outside your door." That produced a soft and humorless laugh.
"They, boy, are not the half of it, are they, Parker?"
"No, my lord," his junior admiral replied as he too sat down.
I have a far from perfect fleet in which every vessel is short of its complement of hands. I must find and hold a base in the Mediterranean, and given we've lost Toulon and elements of the French fleet are still intact, the closer to that port it is, the better. But it will not, under any circumstances, have a dockyard.
Parker cut in.
If you knew the state of repair of some of our ships, Mr. Pearce, it would make your hair stand on end.
I have to deal with my enemies and my allies, Hood continued. One of the latter knowing they very likely deliberately frustrated my aims when we evacuated Toulon. You went to Tunis, so you know I have to keep the ruler there neutral. I must deal with the Austrians, our present hosts, who, if they had sent the 5,000 men they promised, might have allowed me to hold on at Toulon until enough troops arrived from England. Then there are the Italian states, Genoa and Naples, the Ottomans, and half a dozen other powers who must not be driven into the arms of the French. And I find every decision I make questioned by a man, Sir William Hotham, who has the task of supporting me, and signally fails to do so.
"My lord,"
Parker said.
Help yourself to wine, Pearce,
Hood said, as his steward placed a decanter and some fruit on the table. As the man departed, he added,
I am going to take you into my confidence.
"My lord."
Parker, do stop saying that.
"I feel you are being incautious."
Odd, is it not, Pearce? Hood said. You are such an argumentative sod. I actually think I can trust you.
I don't seek your trust, Pearce replied quietly.
No, and it might turn out to be a burden. But I fear the letters I will give you might not convey the true import of what I want to say. Letters never do. I want Hotham removed, and I want it done with dispatch, for I cannot continue in command with him as my leading subordinate. You know, we both know, he set up Berkeley's court-martial to fail.
Which may bring him down, my lord.
You have more faith in politics and the law than I, young fellow. What I want you to do is to back up what I have written.
In what way?
You do not see that Hotham will go out of his way to bring you harm?
You're sure he will do that? Pearce asked.
He has, to mollify Berkeley, put you in mortal danger more than once. And if you can think of another reason why he delayed my orders for HMS Hinslip to evacuate the St. Mondrian Hospital, I cannot. He knew you were there.
So was Captain Berkeley. Would he abandon him too?
I doubt he knew that he was even wounded, let alone where he was. But does it occur to you that Berkeley himself may have become a threat to Hotham?
Parker gave a hearty cough.
My captain of the fleet thinks I speculate too far. But believe me, Pearce, if he knew what you were planning to do regarding Berkeley, he would seek to stop you. And I think he would go to any lengths. I cannot say that in my dispatches, but neither can I be that open in a letter, which could very well be read by others. But you can say it, in private. You can drive home just how pernicious is his influence, and help Billy Pitt to make up his mind.
Suddenly Hood stood up.
Find yourself some accommodation ashore. Send word to me clerk where you are, and as soon as we know which vessel will be going home to refit, we'll put you and those fellows you have fought so hard to free aboard her.
Thank you, my lord. And the letter I came to collect? Hood growled, showing something of his former mood.
I think it best if I hold on to me correspondence, don't you? Given the way you just used me seal. Can't have you carrying them around, can we? Never knowing who you might threaten.
Sir William Hotham was writing a personal letter of his own, not to William Pitt, but to his own political patron, the Duke of Portland, leader of the faction of Whigs who voted under his banner and supported the Tory government in its pursuit of the war with France. Highly unpopular in many quarters, the war was most vehemently opposed by the main section of the Whigs under Charles James Fox. He was supported, more for personal advantage than from any deep conviction, by the Prince of Wales. Like most heirs to a throne, Prinny was at loggerheads with his father, King George, and, conscious of the state of the parental health, sought a regency. This not being the first letter he had composed questioning Samuel Hood's dispositions as C&C of the Mediterranean fleet, he nevertheless felt it necessary, for the sake of clarity, to reiterate some of his previous objections to the way the present campaign had been run, not least in the way Lord Hood had made accommodation with the French royalist naval officers over the occupation of Toulon. It was to his advantage that not all of their capital ships had been destroyed in the recent evacuation, though in his letter, as opposed to Hood's dispatches, there would be no mention of the Spanish reluctance to see Britannia too dominant. Even although it was months since he and Hood had fallen out over that subject, the mere recollection was enough to make Hotham flush angrily. His sound advice had been overruled and ignored. Toulon had been at their mercy, but his commanding officer, instead of sending them an ultimatum, surrender or be destroyed, had sent them an offer of accommodation, allowing them to become allies of the pan-European anti-revolutionary cause. They should have taken Toulon by force, destroyed every ship they could not man and every facility in sight, then withdrawn, leaving the place to the Jacobins to do with what they wished. It was, as all his previous letters had been, a critique of the way things were being run by a man well past his prime, the obvious concomitant being that matters would have progressed better under his own hand. At no time did he mention the strained personal relations between himself and Hood, nor his manifest attempts to modify his clearly stated orders. This was a more in sorrow than anger type of letter. Sanded and sealed, he held it in his hand for a moment before calling for his steward to order up his barge.
"I am going to call upon poor Captain Barclay, who is, I believe, bound for the Shore Hospital. Send for Mr. Burns to accompany me."
Poor Captain Barclay was seething and in pain. The man before him, Lieutenant Glaister, already lambasted for his manifest failures, sat stony-faced and, in his case, it made him look barely alive. Glaister would, by a kindly observer, be called fine-boned. The less well-disposed would describe him as skeletal, with his pronounced cheekbones, high forehead, delicate if pronounced nose, none of which was well defined by his pallid skin, wispy fair hair, and pale eyebrows. He even spoke like a corpse, in his slow Highland way. Behind Glaister stood Cornelius Gerson, relieved that it was now the Scotsman getting it in the neck, not, as previously, him.
"I might remind you,"
Barclay spat, doing just that, given he was repeating himself,
"that we are in the very place where such as we gained from the Toulon arsenal might have been usefully disposed of."
Slowly, Glaister looked at the bulkhead separating the convalescent space from the rest of Captain Sidey's cabin, a silent plea for Barclay to lower his tone. Not a wealthy man, most of his pay was remitted to his father and his worthless Highland estate. He knew to nearly the penny the value of what he had seen tossed into the harbour at Toulon, but he also knew the penalty for discovery. What he had become engaged in was illegal and criminal, and while it stood a chance of turning a profit, while his captain had command of the ship and all the responsibility, he was all for it. But with Barclay wounded, and him in temporary command of HMS Brilliant, he had become exposed. What if a new captain was appointed? It was a situation in which he would bear the brunt of any opprobrium, and he was half sure that Barclay, personally threatened, would deny all knowledge of what the bulging holds of the frigate contained. Stores stolen from the French warehouses with the connivance of the fellows who worked there, payment being a promise to evacuate them in case Toulon was abandoned, not an undertaking ultimately fulfilled.
"We would have had every privateer captain in Leghorn begging us for those supplies," Barclay whispered,
at least taking cognizance of the dangers of being overheard, then wincing as he moved his arm.
"A mint of money, Glaister, and all in hard coin."
"Have you heard yet what is to happen to the command of HMS Brilliant, sir?"
"No."
That was another cause for concern to the wounded man. Hotham had hinted at Ralph Barclay shifting to a ship of the line, a 74, but that had gone from being a promise to a possibility, the whole notion now complicated by his aching wound. There would be no new command till he was fully recovered.
"I wondered if we would be seeing a new commanding officer aboard,"
Glaister added. Ralph Barclay tried hard not to sneer, but he failed.
"You don't hope for elevation yourself, Mr. Glaister?"
"I would not presume, sir, and besides it would require a strong recommendation."
That induced silence. The most telling recommendation should come from Ralph Barclay, and he knew he was being asked if he would put it forward.
"I doubt my opinion would count for much, Mr. Glaister."
There was truth in that. Sir William Hotham might propose, but it was Samuel Hood who disposed, and a word from Ralph Barclay in that quarter was more likely to hinder any chance of a promotion for Glaister than aid it.
"I could ask that, as of this moment, my command be maintained."
"But your wound, sir?"
"It is the very devil at the moment, sir, but it will heal in time."
"Something we all hope for,"
said Gerson, with what he assumed was a sincere smile. The whistling of boatswain's pipes and marines stamping made them all cock an ear. They knew the sound of the arrival of someone important, and it was only moments before the door burst open and Mr. Alt, his face bright red, told them breathlessly that Admiral Sir William Hotham was coming aboard.
"Out, both of you,"
Barclay insisted. They were gone before Hotham was shown in, Toby Burns at his heels, looking more like a faithful dog than a human. Ralph Barclay wondered at the bandage on his head, held in place by his hat. The last time he had seen the little scoundrel had been on the assault in which he had been wounded, or, to be more accurate, not seen him, for Burns had disappeared between the British position and the French.
"Captain Barclay,"
Hotham said with a sympathetic frown,
"I was of the opinion you were in the hospital, and I am of the belief that is where you should be." "I am reasonably comfortable here, sir, and Captain Sidey has duties to perform, and we must get his ship away from the quay before half the crew desert to those damned privateers. I have arranged transport for you, and it will be here shortly." "Most kind, sir," Barclay lied. "Your wife is toiling away there, saint that she is."
Hotham half turned.
"I brought your nephew along to visit you both." "I am sure Mrs. Barclay greeted him most affectionately, sir."
Toby Burns had to look at the deck then, and the reply threw Hotham slightly. It had been impossible not to observe that the youngster's aunt had been less than fulsome in her welcome.
"Wish your uncle well, boy, and then leave us."
"Aye, aye, sir," Burns replied. "I hope you're soon recovered, uncle."
There was no choice given the company but to accept that with seeming grace. But it was hard.
"Well, Barclay,"
Hotham said as Toby Burns exited,
"you will be going home. Although the reason is a damned shame, you will at least see England." "Home, sir? Can I not recover here?" "Captain Barclay, who knows what will happen here with the French on the rampage? No, safer to go back to England to fully recover your strength, then seek employment when you are fully fit."
Ralph Barclay looked hard at Hotham then, wondering if he could change his mind, and guessing from the look of insincere concern he could not.
"In which I hope I can count on your good offices, sir."
That had to be said, even if, inside, Ralph Barclay was both seething and miserable. Hotham laid a hand on Ralph Barclay's good arm.
"Of course. and to aid you, I wish you to do me a service that cannot but enhance your prospects."
Bottom pulled an oilskin pouch from his pocket, dropping his voice at the same time.
"I have here a private letter for the Duke of Portland, and I am charging you with its delivery. I need hardly say that the chance to introduce yourself to such a personage, and in the circumstances show him that you have my complete trust, will ensure that when you reapply for an appointment, given you will have his support, it will be to something of a plum."
Chapter 9. If the celebration of Christmas was muted for the other faiths, it was done by the Papists of Livorno in a way to please Michael O'Hagan, who somehow found a priest with enough English to confess him, with a high mass at the Duomo, then a procession through the streets, the Catholic faithful singing lustily, trailing their mitred and gloriously clad archbishop as he blessed all who knelt to him at the side of each thoroughfare he traversed. Then the divine took to a highly decorated barge, which conveyed him around the canals of the city, each quay crowded with worshippers, finally returning to his splendid palace. Aboard each ship a more prosaic ceremony was the norm. Indeed, many of those celebrating the occasion would have disapproved mightily of what was taking place ashore. To the officers and men of the Mediterranean fleet, all, apart from those of non-commissioned Irish stock, strong adherents of the 39 Articles of their Protestant faith, the shore celebrations were superstitious nonsense, and they would have laughed at the crowds of peasants prepared to abase themselves before their puffed-up prelate.
End of CD 3.